Imagine a resident of Port Harcourt who inhales this soot every second in 24 hours, 7 days a week, 30 days in the month, and for years now, we are dying slowly but surely, and our lifespan is reducing every day.
Stocked early enough all these precious materials you were just mentioning, and we were on the lucky side that our prognosis was spot on in a way, forecasting what kind of material we would need and what quantity we would need.
Good morning, everyone. Bloomberg Surveillance, a very eventful morning. Lisa and I will be in Washington tomorrow, a conversation with the managing director and other worthies of the International Monetary Fund. Futures up 14, Dow futures up 103. We steel ourselves, as we do after a 44-page diamond letter, for what we're going to see from JP Morgan in 15 minutes. Right now on the data, futures up 14. The VIX 24 comes into 23.76. I'm not getting much love in the fixed income market this morning. Curve steepening out to 33 basis points from the invasion panic. For those that don't understand what I just said, email Lisa Bramwood. To you. Oil up 106 on Brent crude. That does get my attention. A nice lift in oil, and of course gold 1983 the ounce as well. The airlines in some difficulty. American Airlines talking about 16% revenue under what they had a number of years ago. They still struggle. Delta Airlines out now with some numbers. We'll have much more on this with Helene Becker scheduled later today. Right now we begin our bank coverage over the next X number of days with Kenneth Leon, Director of Equity Research at CFRA. Ken Leon and Allison Williams have really done the heavy lifting for us here over recent quarters and indeed years through the pandemic. Ken Leon, I went back. We just had Ben Laidler on, who has a single best call on bull market I've seen. And I went to the Ben Laidler low of Christmas Eve 2018. And Mr. Diamond, Fortress Diamond, has delivered 14% plus per year. That to me is almost borderline miracle given a pandemic. How did Jamie Dimon do it? How did he deliver 14% per year total return in this fractured bull market?
We're talking about great management, and it's great to be here today on the kickoff of bank earnings. Probably JP Morgan will continue to outperform its peer group over the next few years. The worry, of course, is what is the outlook for the next quarter or for the rest of this year? And to your point, Tom, a fortress balance sheet has been really the calling card for JP Morgan to endure in the toughest times and to outperform in the best of times.
I see Ken Leon in the 44-page love note, something about Fortress income statement as well. That's Diamond-esque for cut costs. When in doubt, cut costs is the mantra of banking in America. Are we going to be surprised today and over the next coming days with cost sensitivities?
So on cost, there's new forces underway, disruptors in the market from fintech. And even in the last quarter when JP Morgan stock went down, it's because Jamie Dimon was going to double up and invest in hiring people, particularly in technology. So that's going to be kind of the delicate dance that he has, which is it's an efficient bank, but it's a bank that has to keep its pulse on the future, which means investing in technology, and that boosts operating expenses.
In this earnings period, Ken, are people going to really be looking at the granularity of investment in tech and basically the idiosyncrasies of a specific bank in the banking world? Or is it all going to be about the consumer and, oh my gosh, are we heading into recession?
Lisa, I think you hit it right on the nose, because we already know that on the Wall Street side, the first quarter is going to be difficult compared to a year ago. But Main Street It's about the consumer. It's about small business. It's the health of the household and whether they are able to endure, rising inflation and the pressures that go with it. So I think this will be a conversation about, well, if I'm a bank, maybe I can just say, well, loan quality is still good because we're not seeing that. But I think investors really want to know that if there's any changes or cracks as it relates to the consumer, because middle class and lower class Americans are really suffering right now.
Ken, what have we priced in considering the fact that JP Morgan shares are down 16% so far this year?
It's really reflecting maybe the bearish view that we have a higher chance of going into recession next year and stagflation. Banks like JP Morgan outperformed the market up until the middle of February, obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also questions with the rising rate environment, Fed tightening, and also moving from quantitative easing to tightening, that possibly this may not be good for banks, but that's really the potion for banks is rising rates.
So, Ken, as we talk about the possibility of a recession down the line, as we talk about the health of the consumer, what are your expectations on both loan growth, but also on loan loss provisions that may be necessary? It's
a good question. And, going through the consumer side, we expect that card loan growth will be higher, possibly 3 to 5%, personal loans 2 to 3%, auto loans because of the lack of inventory down, mortgages because of rising rates down, and on the commercial and industrial lending, there still isn't a distressed industry. So last quarter, that was up 5%, probably mid-single digit again for commercial loans.
All right, so that's all on the consumer side. If we could go back to the investment banking side for just a moment. Obviously, we're expecting that the deal-making kind of activity was weighed down by geopolitical risk in the first quarter. What does the pipeline look like going forward, though?
The pipeline is always the optimistic views. You really need to take deals from announced transactions to close. Both are down significantly versus a year ago. And essentially what we need to see is more CEO confidence, obviously as it relates to needing capital for either the business or for M&A. And we also need to see really, particularly in equity underwriting, that calendar for IPOs move ahead. The more niche area, which is SPACs, is really gone. That's a thing of the past, I think, from speculation last year. Debt underwriting is going to be positive year over year.
I look, Ken Leon, at the executive derby and, of course, the splash yesterday, particularly in the FT about succession plans, and it is with Mr. Diamond, but with the others as well. Who is behind Mr. Diamond? Who is behind Mr. Moynihan? Do you get a sense that it's an organized succession derby in American big banking, or does it allude to what we see on the TV show Succession?
No, these are really more stable families, and succession, it comes in fits and starts as far as what we talk about, but Jamie Dimon has really put a great lineup of executives below him, particularly with women leadership. Jane Fraser first. We're going to see more of that, Tom, over the next year or so, coming across to the large banks. One, because they're very capable, and two, it's an exciting time for leadership.
I want you to address, Ken Leon, right now what Apple is doing. Of course, I think it was 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, we had the FinTech splash with Apple. They took an Academy Award. They're building 6 football fields in Culver City to take over Hollywood. Are they going to take over 3 zip codes of Manhattan?
Well, if your question is directed as Apple or even Amazon interested in the banking industry, and that was part of Jamie's comments in his letter, is that the large banks are going to see more indirect competition. So, I think, with entertainment, that might be a positive for the banking side, but there's all these encroachments of banking. It just, nothing stays in place, as you know, Tom.
Ken, to Tom's point, you're in Delray Beach right now. We just are dealing with a situation in mass transit in New York City. There is a question about occupancy in some of the office space that we see in Midtown. How much are we going to hear from banks doubling down on New York City as the financial center in these earnings report, kicking off with JP Morgan that's working on those new headquarters?
I also cover the office real estate market, and I think Jamie Dimon's going to say we're still moving ahead with building a new headquarters on Park Avenue. They own it. Goldman Sachs owns their building. But I think for the office real estate market, there's going to be lower occupancy over the next few years, the hybrid model, remote employee, such as myself. And this changes the game for office real estate. 30% of construction in the United States happens in Manhattan.
Wow.
And obviously the Class A trophy buildings, you know, they will get tenants, but it's really what happens really in the Class B. And we're going to see vacancies, and it's very difficult to move them into residential or even into becoming,
interesting,
if you will, warehouses for Amazon.
Well, that's a scope and scale. We love Ken Leon. Please stay with us. And Ken Leon of CFRA will be with us as we see JP Morgan earnings, I'm going to say in 6 minutes or as well. We have much to talk about, including 4 or 5 days of bank earnings. I guess, is it a big day tomorrow? I think so. 14 banks reporting or something between 7 and 7:10 this tomorrow. Lisa and I will be in Washington with the managing director of the International Monetary Fund. And Lisa, I'm sorry, this is a huge deal as Sweden rolls out comments. Now Finland with comments on Vladimir Putin. Lisa, this goes back to 1939 in the Winter War, an 800-mile border between Finland and Moscow. This is the real deal. Finland steps up.
Yeah, and basically talking about this NATO decision as well, is saying that they aren't going to necessarily move in the same kind of way, on the same kind of timescale as Sweden, but also doubling down on this idea of joining NATO and joining it in tandem. How much is this a united front to try to protect the borders? And you've made this point, people taking a look at how close this is getting, and at what point does it tip the needle?
Across the Bloomberg, these are headlines that I would never imagine seeing, and yet there they are, comments from Sweden and Finland, and you wonder the Baltic state reaction as well. Remember that Mr. Putin has a small spit of land in the vicinity of Lithuania, Kaliningrad, where he has a naval exercise, but with no land access to it. That's part of the calculus of the very eastern Baltic Sea as well. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you a data check. We're going to come back with Ken Leon. It is rumored by Shonali Basic's people that she is in the building, and maybe she will be able to give us color on Fortress Diamond. Futures up 21, the VIX 23.52. I would notice dollar. Mr. Diamond has to deal globally with a strong and ascendant dollar. Yen 126.06. In moments, the earnings of JP Morgan.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world. With the first word, I'm Rishka Gupta. Police are looking for someone they call a person of interest in the worst attack in the history of the New York City subway system. 10 people were shot and 13 others hurt in an early morning attack on a subway train in Brooklyn. Detectives are searching for Frank James. They don't know if he was the shooter. They say keys found at the scene of the attack belonged to a U-Haul van that James rented. President Biden has significantly ramped up his condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He now describes Russia's actions as genocide. The president later stood by his comments, but said that lawyers would ultimately make the official determination. Meanwhile, the U.S. is preparing a package of $750 million worth of military aid for Ukraine. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen will warn governments that, in her words, are sitting on the fence over the international effort to punish Russia. In an excerpt of a speech she's giving today, Yellen said the coalition of sanctioning countries will not be indifferent to actions that undermine the sanctions. She also says the sanctions aren't motivated by one country's foreign policy objectives. St. Louis Fed President James Bullard says the central bank needs to raise rates faster. If not, he told the Financial Times, policymakers could lose credibility. Meanwhile, Richmond Fed President Tom Sparkin said that as quickly as possible, the Fed should raise rates to the area where they neither speed up nor slow down the economy. And in China, another sign that COVID lockdowns are disrupting port operations and having an impact on spending. Imports unexpectedly fell last month and export growth slowed down. Imports declined 0.1%. That's the first drop since August of 2020. Exports grew 14.7%, beating estimates, but still slower than the rise in the first 2 months of the year. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
What's happening on Wall Street?
It's the basic law of economics.
The Fed is telling us this is transitory.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
We need to invest in our systems.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Companies now, they're getting hundreds, maybe even thousands of applications. So software has come in to automate the process.
You want to write your resume for robots, not for humans. The only job your resume has is to be comprehensible to the software that is reading it, because that software or robot is going to decide whether or not a human ever gets their eyes on it.
These things are programmed by a certain segment of the population that might not be totally inclusive or not be fully aware.
Concerns about how this technology could exacerbate discrimination. For the FTC, I think foremost, the FTC needs to be making sure that we're fully understanding this technology.
We don't trust companies to self-regulate when it comes to pollution. We don't trust them to self-regulate when it comes to workplace comp. Why on earth would we trust them to self-regulate AI?
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg Terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds.
Daybreak with Lee.
On Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg Technology. This is Bloomberg Green.
On TV, radio, and the web, this is Bloomberg.
There's no two ways about it. Inflation is high. Inflation is too high for the Fed's comfort level. All of the members of the Fed, even the historically dovish ones, have said exactly the same thing. So in that regard, I don't think this actually changes things much.
There is a comment from Seth Carpenter of Morgan Stanley there on an inflation report. And, of course, Ellen Zentner adjusting for Mr. Carpenter as well. JP Morgan's spot on is out with earnings. Of course, this follows on from a bang-up report from Delta Airlines, which is maybe the spirit of America in pandemic recovery. Kenneth Leon is with us with CFRA. He will give us wisdom here in a moment with futures up 18. Amy, help me here. What is JP Morgan doing right now in the stock market?
It's down
as
nearly
we
2%.
go to Sonali Basak in her first blush of these headlines. What is it, 78 headlines you have to digest in 3 seconds?
Yeah, absolutely. But you do have some good news and bad news. The good news being that trading is better than expected, both in fixed income and in equities. The bad news is that provisions for loan losses are a little higher than expected. And as loans are growing, you see them growing at a slightly slower clip than in the fourth quarter, at 5% growth in average loans. That compares to 6% last quarter. So the question is, are they going to get that loan growth that Wall Street was hoping for? And are they starting to prepare for a tougher time ahead?
Let's cut to the chase here. What people want to know is every report Paul Sweeney and I have is deal making in your Wall Street, Sonali, is flat on its back. Is it?
Well, it's flat on its back, Tom. But with that said, debt underwriting, where JP Morgan is the behemoth in the room, debt underwriting is expected to reach about $100 billion this month, which is after the first quarter. So the Jamie Dimon outlook on whether corporations are preparing their war chest for the tough times ahead is going to be
okay. That's Sonali Basak talk for cutting costs. Do you see anything in your first blush of these headlines that 240,000 people or whatever is going to become 230,000?
No. Well, so JP Morgan is one of the few banks that's been increasing headcount, not cutting them as we see as some of the peers here. Jamie Dimon last quarter did telegraph the costs ahead, but I think what Wall Street is missing here is how much of those costs are variable. A question for Jamie Dimon is minimum wages. He just said in his annual letter that the government should be increasing minimum wage across the board. When we asked him the same question here at Bloomberg Television, he said maybe. So are the costs going to go up across the board for his employees continuously, or is he going to hold them stable?
Looking at the shares, are down about 1.6%, fluctuating back and forth between a low of nearly 2% and then going up to negative 1.2%. I'm looking at first quarter investment banking revenue in particular. The banking sector we've been talking about coming under pressure, especially the look ahead, given the fact that people are worried about rising costs and what that will do, coming in at $2.06 billion versus the expected $2.21 billion, given the fact that the shares are already down 16% this year and that the knee-jerk reaction is lower. What is the most important data point that Wall Street's watching?
Well, given that the stock is not reacting well to these numbers, even with the trading beat, Lisa, that nobody really expected, well, it shows you that they're more worried about the loan story here. Investment banking, the pipeline will be important. What my sources are telling me, so that means they're going to go back to looking at them later this year, perhaps September, when things perhaps settle down a little bit. So without that worry about investment banking in particular, the loans here and them not growing, and also the worry about the outlook of the consumer is going to be an overhang. JP Morgan also trades at 1.5, 1.6 times its book value. So that is more expensive than the other banks. Is that fair value, even with that decline? I think that's the big question that people will have to answer.
Sonali Basak, thank you so much. Ken Leon has had time to digest the earnings report of our most dominant bank. As Sonali Basak, folks, mentions the book value, whether it's 1.5, 1.6, compare it to the absolute train wreck, which is European banking before Ukraine, during Ukraine, however you want to frame it, and then it is the overlay of the big banks of America. Ken Leon, let's begin with what the evidence is in this quarter report that JP Morgan leads on ratio analysis.
They do, and it's the only bank, because we talk about rising rates over the last 5 years, the only bank that has had higher net interest income versus where the banks were in 2016. So they're obviously able to grow the base. That's not the problem. The issue is you need that extra kicker from investment banking. And as just noted, that might be on the sidelines until the second half of this year. We don't know.
Well, so on that front, light investment banking for JP Morgan, what's the read-through going to be for the investment banks of tomorrow?
We're all going to see them down with, fee income, especially from equity underwriting and M&A, down 20 to 30%. The calendar, is really, there's hard to find any leading deals right now going into a more optimistic second quarter, which is why I say, given the uncertainties, you have to put that aside and say, where is there going to be spring for the banks? And you have to go back to the traditional lending area to make sure that they're in a good position.
Ken, I want to go to the share buyback. It's on the edge of Tim Cook and Apple. And the bottom line is your colleague in crime, Charles Peabody, was way out front on this with you 6, 7, 8 years ago. Are we now in the full bloom of use of cash flow at these dominant banks where they're going to buy back shares?
That's the bull case, Tom. And essentially, we're months away from the Federal Reserve approving the capital plans. The banks are overcapitalized. And we've heard that from Jamie Dimon and others. We're going to see significant dividend increases or buybacks. The only risk there is who is going to be the vice chair for compliance and regulation at the Fed, and whether they have a different view about capital ratios, which affects return of capital, maybe not this year, but possibly the risk for 2023. That's a wild card.
Ken Leon, thank you so much for helping out this morning. We're going to continue with you, I know, through the week. Lisa Bramlett, I'm sorry, you go to the Bloomberg, you look at the 5-year dividend growth of JP Morgan ascendant out of the great financial crisis, and I believe it says dividend growth of 15% per year.
But it's not necessarily the same growth story overall as a company that it used to be, and I think that is really the story. The fact that you're talking about the cash use as simply being share buybacks as opposed to investment, that's the focus, right? $30 billion of share buybacks is a pretty intense number, especially, frankly, some interesting data that's coming out. First of all, just to give you the basic numbers, to repeat them, the first quarter earnings per share came in at $2.63. That's versus the estimate of $2.72. So there's that miss coming in from the investment banking and some other areas. But also, I want to just point out this little issue. First quarter loan loss provisions were $1.5 billion. That's up $902 million, not because the consumer is weak, but due to inflation. How are they going to deal with inflation at a time where they're not getting the revenues from the investment banking units, from the trading units that perhaps they have relied on?
Yeah, I look at this, folks, and again, we lose the scope and scale of JP Morgan. We were talking about 18,000 people at BlackRock. JP Morgan is over 10 times the head count, 271,000 employees at JP Morgan. I think the last time I looked at that number, it was 260. So they seem to be hiring as well. What do you need to know about this story? Delta Airlines with an Ed Bastian boom report. There's no other way to put it. And Mr. Dimon saying not business as usual, but better than good across his view of American banking. It is an ascendant dollar this morning. The yen 126 handle. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
nuestro estudio, en nuestro experimento, no hemos pintado todos los edificios de blanco, sino estos más asequibles de pintar. Y ya hemos detectado reducciones medias en el área metropolitana de 0,8 grados aproximadamente en un periodo de ola de calor y con picos máximos de 4 grados de disminución en un momento puntual del día, en una zona puntual del día. Y como dices, en una ciudad como Barcelona funciona incluso mejor que las zonas verdes. Según las modificaciones, nos detectan incrementos, o sea, disminuciones de temperaturas mayores con tejados blancos que con incrementos de zonas verdes como tienen planteados el plan director urbanístico.
Why do the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg?
That is a great question.
It's a great question.
It's a great question. Great question. Great question.
Great question.
Great question.
That's going to be the best question I get all night.
I'm glad you asked that.
Bloomberg Television. Top experts, great questions.
There's no two ways about it. Inflation is high. Inflation is too high for the Fed's comfort level.
Inflation's a product of both demand and supply. And yes, demand has got to slow down.
That demand destruction will happen, at some point.
And the Fed's going to be raising rates because the economy looks good and they have runway to do so.
The question remains really, can the market still go higher?
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
Good morning, everyone. Jonathan Farrow, Lisa Abramowitz, and Tom Keene. Mr. Farrow on sabbatical. Kaylee Lyons pulls a short straw today and joins us. There is a set of news this morning that's extraordinary. Sweden and Finland make history talking about joining EU and NATO. This is a huge deal, particularly with Finland. With the 800-mile border, we've got weak yen, dollar ascendant. The market's in a churn, again, off the inflation report. And in New York City, Lisa Abramowitz, no one cares.
Well, yeah, I think that a lot of people are trying to understand just how big of a threat there was from yesterday. As you saw that shooting in a subway station, although I will say, as a native New Yorker, many of the New Yorkers who I know are saying, look, things happen, don't let the terror win. Nobody died, we're dealing with it, and they're working to apprehend the individual. Very much front and center right now, though, is very much earnings, as we do get JP Morgan's earnings and Delta's earnings. And what a tale of two different economic stories.
Well, I think they both show the resiliency here of JP Morgan through the panic and all as well. But Kaylee, Delta Airlines, and this goes back to a conversation I had with Mr. Bastian, I'm going to say 2 years ago, and he said domestic comes back and international will take some time. My tone is take some time is now.
Yeah, that's the message getting from Delta's statement. They talk about an accelerating return of not just international, Tom, but business travel as well. Robust consumer demand, which echoes Jamie Dimon over at JP Morgan talking about a healthy consumer. What's also notable within Delta's release is they say they are successfully recapturing higher fuel prices because, of course, that is a headwind these airlines have been facing. But Delta flying in early hours, Tom, a big beat or a narrower loss than expected.
And then, Lisa, this goes to the great discrepancy out there of linking the eco-babble we trade in Fed speak, the parlor game and such, with the reality of how people react. Now, maybe the banks in the gloom will cut costs, who knows? Bastian didn't mince words. He needs 10,000 bodies.
The airline industry and the banking industry are two completely different worlds right now, which are giving us a very similar story, which is a high degree of uncertainty. You've got consumers that want to emerge from a pandemic and travel. I mean, the travel numbers are nearly where we were back in 2019. If you look at the Delta transcript, over at JP Morgan, they're building reserves for losses because of the global uncertainty. And this has raised a lot of questions. Yes, it's because of inflation, but it's also because of the geopolitical concerns. How do you game that out at a time when your commodities are swinging like Bitcoin?
No, the answer is you game it out by moving forward and staying in touch with the news flow. We'll attempt to give you that news flow this morning. And again, for all of you, particularly on Bloomberg Radio in New York City, we are riveted to every news source led by our Michael Barr on this tragedy in Brooklyn and the morning after across the five boroughs. Right now, I want to look at the data. Futures up 25, Dow futures up 161. The VIX exceptionally constructive at 23.38. Yields, let's review. Pre-inflation, 2.80. Sigh of relief off core inflation. We come in 280 into 2.73. It is a dollar-centric morning with dollar stronger. This will be one of my themes with Kristalina Georgieva tomorrow in Washington. DXY shows 100, but critically, the Japanese yen finally gives me a 126 print with comments from the Bank of Japan and the Japanese government over the ramifications of weak yen for their, well, some would say house of cards financial system. That would be phrases from Martin Feldstein, the late Martin Feldstein of Harvard from 30 years ago. We'll leave it at that right now. I do want to point out Swiss franc earlier was to a 100 level, strong Swiss franc as well. With a brief on this unique morning, Lisa Abramowitz.
Unique is right. There is so much going on, and trying to piece it together with a cohesive narrative is quite difficult. At 8:30 a.m., this is what I am watching. JP Morgan is going to host their analyst call. I know Sonali Basak is going to be watching this as well. Following the earnings that they posted, how much do we hear a confirmation of some of the pessimism that's being reflected in the shares this morning? Just to remind you, JP Morgan shares are down 16% year to date in the intraday trading. They're down 1.5%. There was a brief reprieve after the announcement of a $30 billion buyback. However, people are focused on investment banking underperforming, coming in short of estimates, as well as this concern about the credit loss provisions actually going up. Even as they say the consumer is strong, that's not the issue. It's internationally. What is going to happen? We don't know. The uncertainty is palpable, and it is causing JP Morgan to act. 8:30 a.m. we get U.S. March PPI data at the same time. This is also really important. The data expected to come in above 10% in terms of year-over-year inflation in some of the base products. This, as the war in Ukraine causes those costs to go up. How much does this give a feeling to that peak inflation that we heard yesterday in the CPI versus perhaps a little bit more muddied story? How much does this really look forward to a difficult period for year-over-year base comparisons for inflation rolling over? And at 10 a.m. we get a Bank of Canada meeting. This is going to be the first of the developed markets to raise probably by 50 basis points, also to announce a balance sheet roll-off. How much are we going to see markets respond? How much, Tom, to your dollar point here, how much is this basically just trying to catch up with the Fed that is ready to go and ready to go quickly?
Yeah, I mean, there it is. And I look at Looney and 126.50 really doesn't give me much information. There's a hydrocarbon overlay. I get that. But I do take your point that there can be signals, Lisa, from Canada and from New Zealand of value to the U.S. analysis. Lisa, I'm shocked. There's no auction talk. What happened?
There is a 30-year auction at 1 p.m. There also is Janet Yellen speaking at 10 a.m. I could go on. There are lots of events that are happening today. It is a very busy morning and very much in the economic focus, still very much front and center, inflation and earnings.
That's a Lisa we know. Right now, Kaylee Lyons, Lisa Abramowitz, and Tom Keenan, radio and television. And we're going to digress here to the cross moments, the dynamics of the equity market and the signals forward. We do that with Amy Wu Silverman at RBC Capital Markets. Amy, there's a new volatility, which is around once-in-a-lifetime events like the war in Ukraine. What is the exact precise volatility signals that you see in the equity market?
Morning, guys. So, look, Tom, it's very bifurcated. We continue to see large hedges placed more kind of long duration. But in the near term, we actually see a lot of optimism from option markets, too. People placing bullish trades, and, part of that is related to earnings. And the VIX environment we're in is interesting because, 23 is sort of medium. We consider that medium vol, but when you look over kind of 20, 30 years, medium vol is typically not great for stocks as well as high volatility environments.
Given the fact that you're seeing optimism in options, does that mean that traders right now are not pricing in a hard landing, are not pricing in further tail risk from the conflict in Russia? And is that the suggestion that we're seeing from the chairs of JP Morgan and the reaction this morning?
Yeah, it's a great question. Here's what I would say. The option markets are short-term fairly bullish, but longer term, they are still quite bearish. So I think there is an acknowledgement, Lisa, of potential recession, of possible hard landing, of all these things that we know are out in the distant future. But, memories are quite short. And in the next 4 to 6 weeks, the outlook is actually not that blurry, and people are actually placing trades that are more to the upside than the downside.
And what's the difference between micro options plays versus macro plays, considering the macro has dominated for pretty much the duration of this year, Amy, but now that earnings season is underway, that story may change?
Absolutely. So it's interesting. I was looking at you guys talking about JP Morgan earlier when the headlines came across.
Hello, day traders. How are you today? Please place your order to buy British pound. The price I'm looking to buy 130.003.4. Okay, let's place order 130.003.4. Okay, let's hope we will get filled with this order. Okay, if you want to get the strategy, you need to go to company.co.uk to get the strategy. Otherwise, you can copy this trade and you stay with me. We will close this trade in profit together. Okay, guys, I'll speak to you later.
What the options are saying they're going to move, those things are quite cheap right now, and those are opportunities to kind of own that volatility through either owning calls or owning puts.
Amy Silverman, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it this morning with RBC Capital Markets. Lisa, the oddest of oddest things yesterday, the first really decent spring day with that sun lingering into a longer afternoon and the cacophony of sirens of our security providers, our fire department at work. The mayor wakes us up this morning with headlines.
Yeah, he's coming out and saying that this time they do believe that the shooter acted alone, was not part of necessarily a larger group effort. And this confirms what they were saying yesterday. They were not treating this as a terror threat. The details, though, not very forthcoming. And when it comes to who the person of interest is, the connection to the case, and how close they are to an arrest. And Tom, people are trying to ascertain that so they can gauge the risk going forward.
Now, the subway station is open again. For those without the map, this is directly south of the Brooklyn Bridge. As you go across the tunnel past Governor's Island, you move further south away from JFK and Queens to the southwestern tip, if you will, of Brooklyn along the shore there. And that huge subway nexus is open now. Mr. Adams says that he reached out to victims and any number of other headlines coming from his conversation at present with ABC. Very good news in that only 4 victims remain in the hospital, that according to the mayor of New York City. We will continue with our coverage. Extraordinary headlines from Scandinavia this morning. Of course, we'll hear from Anne-Marie Horton, Washington, in a moment. And in the markets, equities ascended, futures up 27. JP Morgan earnings are out. This is Bloomberg.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world. With the first word, I'm Rishka Gupta. The Biden administration is preparing a military aid package worth roughly $750 million for Ukraine. The president is allowed to transfer equipment from U.S. stockpiles without congressional approval in order to speed up delivery during an emergency. The U.S. has provided more than $2.4 billion in military assistance to Ukraine since President Biden took office. And police in New York are searching for what they call a person of interest in the shooting at a Brooklyn subway stop. 23 people were injured, 10 of them shot, and no suspect has been caught. Detectives are looking for a man named Frank James. Keys found at the scene belonged to a U-Haul van that James rented. Police don't know if he was indeed the shooter. And in the UK, inflation jumped more than expected last month to a 30-year high. Consumer prices in March rose at an annual rate of 7%, and a higher inflation is on the way. This month, there will be a 54% increase in the energy price cap. And the International Energy Agency has cut its forecast for global oil demand this year. That's after China reimposed lockdowns to contain the spread of the coronavirus. Plus, a number of IEA members, led by the US, have released oil from their emergency stockpiles. Google is putting money behind its bid to get more workers back in its buildings. The company plans to invest $9.5 billion in offices and data centers in the US this year. Google expects to create 12,000 jobs. As part of the investment, tech companies have struggled to balance getting workers back to the office without causing unrest amongst their staff. Global News, 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Rishika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
The Indian city of Jamnagar is a money-making machine for Asia's richest man, Mukesh Ambani. His company Reliance has the world's biggest oil refinery complex here in the city. Jamnagar is also where Ambani is making his newest bet, a $10 billion investment in green energy. His ambition is closely aligned with the Indian government's plan to reach net zero emissions by 2070. But Ambani is not alone. India's second richest man, Gautam Adani, has committed $20 billion of investment over the next decade. But India's massive dependencies on fossil fuels have some environmental advocates questioning the realism and sincerity of those green ambitions and those of its two biggest billionaires.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com webinars.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
Earnings season is coming.
The bar is pretty high.
We're going to see lower earnings growth.
The sentiment on financials has been pretty dour.
Bloomberg breaks the numbers first.
Tesla's gaining on record deliveries for the first quarter.
The industrial sector is getting hit pretty hard.
Every tick down is a big deal.
With exclusive expert analysis.
There are a couple of things that concern us.
We have to break out a different playbook.
There are opportunities out there.
Bloomberg Television and Radio. The fastest numbers and analysis you trust.
This president is dispatching his team to do everything we can to help ease energy price pressures, most notably, of course, a very aggressive, historically significant release of barrels of oil from the strategic reserve, and not just here, but in coordination with many of our allies.
Jared Bernstein, an exceptionally astute student of our labor economy, providing service to Joe Biden for many, many years before the presidency, and of course with the Council of Economic Advisors. I want to bring to your attention with the headlines that we see from Mayor Adams. He is scheduled to join Bloomberg Surveillance later this morning. We hope to bring that to you in the later 8 o'clock hour. Recovering from COVID and, of course, exceptionally distracted this morning, there is a person of special interest who is at large within the 5 boroughs, or perhaps Philadelphia, Milwaukee, and other parts of this nation. We are distracted with futures up 26, JP Morgan out with what I'll call JP Morgan-like earnings, BlackRock out with earnings, Delta ball out of the park. Delta doing quite well this morning. Where were we on Delta, Amy? You're up 4% on Delta, I think, at one point. The dollar ascendant is my major message this morning on the data front. My other message is there's 14 things to talk to Anne-Marie Horton about and not enough time. Anne-Marie Horton, the ultimate mystery for Vladimir Putin with his look south to the Black Sea and Ukraine is he may give up the Russian power of the Baltic Sea, the Baltic states, and now with Sweden and Finland this morning with truly historic announcements. Tell me about Joe Biden and the focus on the Baltic states, and particularly on Finland, with basically the youngest leader on the planet, a woman who has been in politics since age 20. She is 34, and Sanna Marin, the prime minister, is someone that we don't know. How will Joe Biden prosecute the beginning of Sweden and Finland into NATO?
Well, let's first say, Tom, as you mentioned, this is pretty historic because what you're seeing is massive changes, really substantial changes in the polls and public opinion and even political support, especially in Sweden, the Social Democrats with local reporting, that they are now potentially moving to want to back a NATO entrance. This is very significant. When it comes to Finland, we did have the president of Finland. The president is a little bit more foreign policy focused. This is President Niinisto. He was recently in Washington and he spoke to President Biden. He's been called upon a lot by a number of leaders, not just President Biden, because he is somewhat of what people call a Putin whisperer. What you have in Finland at this moment is they released this white paper on security concerns, and this would pave the way, and this would become a debate in Parliament and could pave the way from them joining NATO, which would be really a huge shift and would draw the ear of President Putin.
Right now, we're trying to ascertain the allegations of chemical weapons, and this really has only been unconfirmed allegations. However, it is significant because if confirmed, it raises a question of what is NATO's response, let alone who belongs to NATO. How do they deal with this? Right. What's the latest?
Well, all we've heard is that there would be severe consequences, and you heard that from the President of the United States as well as other leaders, and they haven't yet orchestrated or outlined what exactly, quote unquote, those severe consequences and that response would be to the Kremlin. This is obviously something the United States is trying to get a hold of. It's very difficult right now considering the U.S. doesn't have military presence on the ground. What we do know that is the United States is going to be sending more military equipment. They are having a drawdown, $750 million, and this doesn't even have to go through Congress the way it's going. It goes right from the U.S. stocks to Ukraine.
Well, let's talk about what aid the U.S. is sending on that front. $750 million worth of military assistance. Where are they drawing the line, though, Anne-Marie, on what they're willing to send?
Fighter jets. President Zelensky has asked a number of times for fighter jets. He's called for a no-fly zone. This does seem, at the moment, the line the United States is drawing in terms of the equipment they are planning to send. Although we don't have a readout, this is only based on reports. We don't have the official announcement yet, and we don't have a readout of what is going to be detailed in that $750 million worth. So that is something we will be watching today and the rest of the week.
And Maria, on this tragedy in New York, and, frankly, to the east of Brooklyn, Anne-Marie, you've basically lived this. The president is going to be asked today, what are you going to do about violence, crime? I saw one statistic of homicides over 3 years in Chicago up 49%. Whatever the numbers are, doesn't matter. Somebody's going to say to the president, what are you going to do about it? How's he going to respond?
Well, the president has said a number of times that he does think that gun violence and crime, especially gun crime, is endemic in American society. He recently spoke about this just 2 days ago. He was talking about ways to go after these ghost guns. You could print them off 3D printers. You could take them at home. They don't have serial numbers, and they're incredibly difficult to track. At this same speech, he put the onus on Congress to act as well, to go after more expanding background checks, to go after assault weapons, saying that what he did in the 90s, he worked on legislation that was controversial, but was so much more needed in society. So I'm sure he's going to talk about what the administration has already been doing, but he is going to pivot and also tell Congress that they need to do more. But there are a number of bills that the House has passed. The issue is, with a 50-50 split Senate, a lot of these bills will not see the light of day if in the Senate, and then they won't go to the president's desk. And that's probably what his message will be.
Anne-Marie, this is the division of America, ascendant with the Senate, of agriculture and urban. Who's winning the battle right now in this crime debate?
Oh, that's a good question, Tom. I think it's very difficult, right? Because I think a lot of the world in America lives in their echo chambers. So when you hear from Democrats, they say that the Republicans do not support their initiatives enough, like banning assault weapons, and they say this leads to crime. And then you hear from Republicans, and they say, look at what Americans are attacking the administration for, and they want more to be done. It's crime, inflation, it's the economy, and they always say that a lot of this crime has happened under Democratic leadership. So when you look at the polls, though, it's clear this is something Americans want Washington to focus on. Statistics are stunning. Anne-Marie Horton, thank you so much, and we'll continue this discussion through the morning. The mayor of New York City scheduled to be with us in the 8 o'clock hour. Lisa, the news flow this morning, the headline news flow, is just extraordinary. And all of a sudden, China to the rescue. This is something, Lisa, you've been out front on.
Well, the idea that they're going to ease further as a result of some of the slowing growth that they've been observing as a result of the lockdowns from COVID. Basically, China State Council promised to use that triple-R rate cut as needed and just basically said that they're going to try to boost consumption. This has been a mystery. How is China's economy going to persist, given what we're seeing with the lockdowns?
Particularly what we saw off the WTO yesterday with an under 3% global GDP statistic. Coming up, Michael Schumacher, Wells Fargo. Stay with us.
Okay, guys, as you can see, it moved up quite substantially. So let's cancel this order for time being. Let's see what's going to happen later. But it's not much point to hold order to buy a British pound. Look, it's moving up, and it's still moving up. Okay, guys, please cancel this order and stay with me. We'll find some other good chances and opportunities to trade this Forex today.
When you think of cutting-edge technology at sea, you might be thinking of stuff like this. But there's an incoming revolution on the high seas that isn't quite as sexy, but could be significantly more impactful.
Container shipping is the key component of global trade. About 80 or 90% of all the world's goods are transported at sea at some point.
But there's a significant unseen cost to the modern era of global commerce.
About 3% of all the world's CO2 emissions come from shipping.
3% may not sound like a lot, but that's roughly comparable to the entire CO2 output of Germany. Since reducing trade isn't a likely option, what about a technological improvement to help reduce the emissions from these well-stocked maritime behemoths?
Bloomberg Surveillance, we say good morning to you on radio and television. An eventful morning, a serious morning in New York City with the sound of sirens nonstop last night on Bloomberg radio and television. We'll continue to give the headlines right now centered around the mayor of New York making the media rounds. He says we do not know enough about the motivation of anyone shooting in this instance. We hope to have Mayor Adams with us at 8:45 this morning. Global headlines, lots going on, including China moments ago. Speaking of accommodation, I do want to state Brent crude launching to 106.77. Oil underplayed in the last couple days is higher in dollar strength right now. Take a look at that in a moment. Right now, on the equity market, on Delta, JP Morgan and others, Kaylee Lines.
Well, yeah, let's focus on those big earnings stories of this morning, Tom. JP Morgan first. On the bright side, you had big trading beats on both FICC and equities. But on the negative side, investment banking came up short. And also, really one of the standouts, $1.5 billion in loan loss provisions. They are having to set aside more money, that contributing to the miss on the EPS front as the bank is facing these headwinds like inflation, like the conflict in Russia. You do have a $30 billion buyback at play, though, that the bank is announcing that the shares are off of session lows in the pre-market, but still down a little more than 1%. Not too much read-through, though, into peers. Citigroup and Wells Fargo relatively unchanged in early hours at the moment. Then on to Delta. This is a really positive story. Delta, one of the big outperformers in the early session here, Tom. You had a narrower loss than expected, revenue beat, and really just bullish sounding in the statement. They talk about a return in business and international travel, robust consumer demand and the ability to recapture higher fuel prices. Basically, Tom, the point of the story here is they're pretty confident they can charge you more for your tickets to Paris or wherever else you want to go in order to offset those higher fuel costs with higher fares. So Delta is up 5.5% in early hours, and a positive read-through to other airlines. American and United each nearly up 5 percentage points as well, Tom.
Kaylee Lyons, thank you so much. This is a joy. Michael Schumacher joins us now, head of macro and rate strategy at Wells Fargo. And I really want to point out here, Wells Fargo getting some sell-side love recently is maybe a bank ascendant. That's outside the remit of Mr. Schumacher. But Michael, you've got buried in your research note the arch question of the moment, which is a study of this so-called terminal rate, the rate that we're heading for out there. Your management, Mr. Sharp and the others, to be honest, they're really focused on that. What do you tell them about where our rate is heading?
Yeah, Tom, from our perspective, it's pretty interesting. We think the terminal rate has to go up, and probably a fair bit. So let's talk about just what exactly that is. So it's the market's estimation of where the Fed ends the tightening cycle. Currently, it's a little bit above 3%, middle of 23. We think that number probably has to get up to about 350. And the reason for that is that the inflation backdrop is so challenging, and there's so many crosswinds, it's going to be very difficult for the Fed to land that plane. Mike, I think the Fed takes out insurance by going a bit higher than it might otherwise do. So we think the terminal rate's got a lot higher to go, though it's pretty ill for the front end of the U.S. Treasury curve.
How much does inflation have to come down to give some comfort? We've been talking about peak inflation after yesterday's CPI report. Can it go down to 4% and be comforting, or is that still well above where it needs to be?
It is well above where it needs to be, Lisa, but it's a function of speed. So let's say inflation is running at 4% annualized toward the end of this year, so maybe in the fourth quarter of this year. Is that okay for the Fed? Is that okay for the economy? No, those are bad numbers. That's not going to work. Now, if instead inflation were to drop down to 4% by, let's say, September 1st or something, that would be pretty good progress. So it's really a question of how quickly does inflation drop. I think we can all acknowledge it's likely to fall. It's going to fall pretty quickly, but does it get to that 4% number? Let's say by the end of the year, that's an open question. And if that's a result, it's 4%-ish, it's simply too high.
What are you looking for going forward? We were talking about yesterday's CPI, today's PPI. We're getting all of these data points, and a lot of people are looking past them and saying we can't really rely on one data point. When do they start to add up to whether the Fed has to be even more hawkish or whether they can back away?
It's a function of a couple things, Lisa. So yes, the flow of the inflation data, that certainly counts. Also labor market indicators. Labor market's super tight. It's probably a good canary in the coal mine, if you will, for proxy of economic tightness. But I think if you had to point to one single economic variable, really as a measure of how tight Fed policy is, for me, it's real rates. In particular, let's say the real rate, the real yield on the 10-year Treasury. Right now, it's minus 15, 20 basis points. That probably has to get substantially higher, well above zero. And the Fed's going to have to try to calibrate that. So to look at the inflation flow data, look at the labor, and then focus on reals.
Mike, when does it get above zero?
Well, it's been moving pretty rapidly. I'd say that could happen anytime in the next few weeks. The obvious date to point to, I think, for a catalyst is May 4th. What does the FOMC deliver? Does it really step up with 50 basis points? Does it announce the balance sheet runoff? If both of those things happen, then I think that's the day it tends to probably break through zero.
Well, and Mike, as we talk about the rate hikes, where they ultimately will get to, of course, you had Jim Bullard again out overnight in an interview with the Financial Times talking about how they need to go above neutral. What is your understanding of where neutral is? Does that line up with where the Fed thinks neutral is? Jim Bullard thinks it's 2%, not 2.5%.
Yeah, Mr. Bullard's been pretty hawkish, let's say. I think the idea of let's get Fed funds up dramatically right now. I think that's the program. But as far as neutral, that's flexible. And remember, the Fed announced average inflation targeting a couple of years ago. We all sort of forgot about it. The Fed never defined what average meant. But in terms of neutral, is it still 2%? That seems pretty iffy. I suspect it's something higher than that. And I guess I turn it around a little bit and say, more or less to Lisa's comment a moment ago, where does the Fed declare victory? What's a good result for the Fed? Is it 2? Is it 2.5? 2.5, I think, is probably fine. So is that long run neutral? I don't know that it is, but is it okay for this cycle? Yes, we think it would be.
On the construction of the real yield, Michael Schumacher, we have the nominal rate with obviously a second derivative up, some real convexity in the 10-year yield. You've got some guesstimate of inflation, and you get a residual, which is the inflation-adjusted yield. Which of those three numbers is the most interesting to you right now?
It's the real yield, so it's the inflation-adjusted yield, Tom. And the reason I say that is that's really economic variable. That's what if I'm investing for the long run, that's what I expect to earn economically. So for me, looking at that and getting a negative number for the bulk of the Treasury curve, that tells me policy is still very accommodative. And it tells me the bond market, frankly, is not very attractive for most people. So if you're simply putting money to work on an absolute return basis or individual investor, which you go piling into bonds, only if you're really risk averse. But as far as the prospects going forward, they're not all that appealing. Real yields have to go higher, in my view, and that's why I think it's the most interesting.
In the meantime, one reason why people have been saying that the Fed can afford to raise rates as much as they're now predicting is because earnings have remained strong. We see that corporate strength, and we're getting a slew of earnings. Delta certainly is a demonstration of that. Perhaps J.P. Morgan less so, although that's debatable. They're still doing just fine. And then Bed Bath & Beyond comes out with disappointing results. Their shares absolutely tanking. And Mike, how much do bad results actually mean something significant for the Federal Reserve that's looking for some reduction in the momentum in order to orchestrate something more like a soft landing and not over-tighten and commit a policy error?
That's interesting there, Lisa. You hear a lot of talk about financial conditions needing to tighten. What does it mean? It means equity prices probably need to be a little less frothy. That means come down a bit. Does it mean sector by sector? No, I don't think so. But I suspect the Fed would be pretty happy if stocks sort of held their own for a while, maybe dropped a little bit, not too much. But that sort of backdrop where, quote, risk assets tread water, maybe high yield bonds sort of do the same, treasuries back up a bit, you take a lot of the steam out of the system. That's the kind of result the Fed wants. But of course, the Fed does want that to proceed fairly slowly, cautiously, so not to cause a ton of damage. Is that easy to do? I think it's incredibly difficult. I'm skeptical anyone can do it. Let's hope the Fed gets it right.
Michael, thank you so much. Michael Schumacher with Wells Fargo today on the dynamics of the fixed income market. And again, a 10-year yield from a 2.80 in 8 basis points, a lower yield off of the angst of, what am I going to say, Lisa, 20 some hours ago. Lisa, tell me about the 30-year bond auction. I'm serious. It's way out there. It's the old benchmark. It's not the new benchmark. The 30-year bond auction to me is what is it? It's a pension purchase. Is that what it is?
And actually, this is an interesting point. You raised it recently about how pensions actually have money to put back into the bond market. Yeah. So if you're getting the most yield going back to 2019 for 30-year notes, why not jump? You're getting 2.8% yields. Well, maybe because you think that the benchmark rate for the Fed is going to go to beyond that. So then it might not be so good over the long term if you think it could stick. And this will be the interesting conundrum that perhaps we'll get some details on. I'm sure you'll be watching the internals carefully, Tom.
Kaylee Lyons, open question. What do you see out there?
I'm looking at earnings. We've been focusing so much on this macro picture, Tom, on monetary policy, on the specter of inflation, on the war in Ukraine. It's getting more and more micro. And yes, all of those issues are likely to show up in each and every report we see. They showed up for J.P. Morgan this morning. But fundamentals, Tom, what kind of support will they or won't they provide to an equity market that has been confronting so many macro risks for the duration of this year so far?
Be interesting to see. I want to go to the Japanese yen. Ben Emmons and others writing this up a day. Lisa, this is really important. I can't say enough, Lisa, over the years, how I find global New York Wall Street tends to ignore Japan. It's over there. It's different. It doesn't matter. I looked at trade-weighted yen this morning back, I think, 35 years. Maybe it was 25 years. What an ugly picture of depreciation.
All right. Tom, have you ever heard someone on Wall Street say, oh, Japan's just over there? I mean, literally every note this morning has been talking about the yen and this incredible move and what this means for trying to control a yield curve when the economy, when the fundamentals are really taking over. And that, I mean, I think that Kaylee was right to bring up earnings, because if you don't have the momentum, you can't really hike. But if you have inflation, what do you do?
That is there, and we'll have much more on that. The Japanese yen moving from, what was it, 110-ish? We're now out to 126, weaker yen. We will be briefed on this. This is our conversation of the day on foreign exchange on the move. Stephen Englander will join us of the Standard Chartered Bank. Thrilled to have the expert of cross rates with us. This is Bloomberg.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world with the first word, I'm Ritika Gupta. Police are looking for someone they call a person of interest in the worst attack in the history of the New York City subway system. 10 people were shot and 13 others were hurt in an early morning attack on a subway train in Brooklyn. Detectives are searching for Frank James. They don't know if he was the shooter. They say keys found at the scene of the attack belonged to a U-Haul van that James rented. President Biden has significantly ramped up his condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He now describes Russia's actions as genocide. The president later stood by his comments but said that lawyers would ultimately make the official determination. Meanwhile, the U.S. is preparing a package of $750 million worth of military aid for Ukraine. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen will warn governments that, in her words, are sitting on the fence over the international effort to punish Russia. In an excerpt of her speech she's giving today, Yellen says the coalition of sanctioning countries will not be indifferent to actions that undermine the sanctions. She also says the sanctions aren't motivated by one country's foreign policy objectives. And in China, another sign that COVID lockdowns are disrupting port operations and having an impact on spending. Imports unexpectedly fell last month and export growth slowed down. Imports declined 0.1%. That's the first drop since August of 2020. Exports grew 14.7%. That's beating estimates, but still lower than the rise in the first 2 months of the year. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
What's happening on Wall Street?
It's the basic law of economics.
The Fed is telling us this is transitory.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
We need to invest in our systems.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
When you think space, you probably think one space agency that travels under the radar is ESA, which is surprising considering what the European Space Agency has achieved and how vital it is to the global space industry.
We've collaborated with pretty much everybody who is involved in space exploration.
ESA wants to be a leading force in furthering humanity's mission into space.
Commander Ground, do you copy? Copy.
If we want to have successful human missions to Mars, we are going to have to learn to live and work off-world in a different way. The place where we are going to learn to do that is on the moon.
Can ESA help humanity take its next giant leap?
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg Terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds.
That over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Crypto, you have a world of young people that want their own financial system and their own culture. And it is very powerful, and I'm a big believer in it.
That the Federal Reserve, since it's in a tightening mode, a stronger dollar acts as consistent with that. That is, it helps the Federal Reserve tighten policy. I think that there's nothing really standing in the way of a stronger dollar here, as long as the Fed continues to be on this path towards an aggressive tightening cycle.
Mark Chandler of Bannockburn there, a very important conversation yesterday with a gentleman steeped in years and decades of foreign exchange study. We're now going to do what we do best at Bloomberg Surveillance, and that is speak to someone truly expert. Stephen Englander is global head of G10 FX research at Standard Chartered. They have a fantastic Bill Winters remit to look at emerging markets, and particularly the Pacific Rim up to Japan. Stephen Englander, thank you so much for joining us this morning. The ramifications of a weaker Japanese yen, now at 126, out to 130. What does that do to the degrees of freedom that Powell and Lagarde have? How does weak yen redound back to an unraveling of the yen redound back to America and Europe?
Well, I'd say that the yen is very exceptional, along with the euro, where the central banks have some ambiguity with respect to how hawkish they want to be. In fact, the BOJ is downright dovish. ECB is kind of on the fence. I don't think it's going to change very much what the Fed does. I don't think the impact on U.S. inflation or global growth is that strong. And the yen weakness is probably partly reflecting Chinese economic growth weakness, and Governor Kuroda's adamant insistence that they can continue the same kind of policy with Japanese rates drifting further and further away from everyone else's.
It is such an artificiality, particularly with this phrase of buying their own paper on board at the Bank of Japan. The Standard Chartered view on this: is Japan something that will amend in a malleable way to the shocks of weak yen and all around it in this experiment of YCC? Or do you worry that something could snap?
Well, I'd say we're not very excited about the continuation of YCC under current circumstances. We don't see a huge benefit to Japan from a weaker yen at this point in a world where growth is kind of limited by supply. Having a weaker currency doesn't really increase your ability to supply more. You just pay more for imports. Now, in the case of Japan, they've wanted to get their inflation up, for many years, almost a decade or more. But the problem is that they want to get domestic inflation up, not kind of make the population poorer because import costs are higher. So we don't see kind of where this is headed.
And I'm looking right now at a very confusing picture when you take a look at the words from the Bank of Japan Governor Kuroda versus other authorities that are concerned about what you said, which is rising costs. Kuroda, meanwhile, is the one who's doubling down on easing policies and this sort of yield curve control. At what point will there be a break, and will he be forced to back away from the purchases that Tom was talking about and really pay more attention to the yen?
It may not be immediate. You know, in a number of places, the limit to how weak the currency can be in G10 countries is sometimes how expensive it is to travel abroad, but there's not that much of it now. Quite possibly the erosion of real wages in Japan is going to become a political issue down the road. So that might end up being the limiting factor. And I think as you know, many have discussed, I mean, YCC is great if it's kind of demand shocks that you're kind of trying to control, and if your forecast of developments are good and it provides guidance. When circumstances have changed as much as they have, it's not clear that YCC is the tool that really gives you the flexibility that you need.
Steve, you mentioned that part of the yen weakness may have to do with the growth story in China, and it strikes me that the BOJ isn't the only central bank we're talking about keeping policy easy while everyone else is out there hawking. China is as well. We were just talking about China, talking about further RRR cuts if needed. Why aren't we seeing more weakness for renminbi that we're seeing for the Japanese yen?
Well, you know, there's lots of moving parts for China. I think that the entry of China into the global, you know, financial system, the opening up of China markets, there is capital inflow into China, and I mean, it's very basic, but you know, the fact that they have such a large trade surplus on an ongoing basis, they're just not spending much abroad. They usually travel a lot. They're not, and you know, their current account is strong, and they have capital inflows that usually, you know, that's a good sign for the currency. Obviously, I think that there's some concerns about the impact of the latest COVID wave and their ability to grow and how aggressive the policy easing is going to be. But there's some tailwinds to CNY that you can't ignore.
Steve Englander, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. With Standard Chartered Bank on short notice this morning, and I really want to emphasize the stir domestically in Japan over weak yen. It may seem a bit obtuse, but it's something global Wall Street's really focused on. There's a whole series of headlines coming out on New York City. We'll keep abreast of those and try to bring you clarity. The mayor of New York will be joining us here at 8:45. Lisa, I want to go, and Shonali Basak brought this up. The J.P. Morgan earnings marred by $524 million loss tied to Ukraine. I get that, but to me, that's a rounding error when you look at scope and scale of J.P. Morgan.
It's a rounding error, but the trajectory is the wrong direction. It wasn't just that. It was the credit loan losses that they also increased by $900 million because of the risks to the downside, because of not only Russia exposure, but inflation more broadly. Going to that point, linking it to the story of Japan, at what point is inflation going to hamper growth? And that's why I go to not just J.P. Morgan, but that's why I mentioned Bed Bath & Beyond. They missed dramatically, and they blamed supply chain disruptions, which they said will continue to weigh on both goods as well as the inflationary pressure. And honestly, I'm looking at this and how much is this a smokescreen, right, for poor performance? When can you sort of back out what kind of economic ramification this is going to have versus poor execution at a specific company, Tom?
And Kaylee, it brings forward tomorrow and what we'll see from, I think, 15 banks reporting.
A good deal of them, Tom. Basically, everyone else among the big banks, other than Bank of America, which will report on Monday, is going to report tomorrow. So what is the read-through from J.P. Morgan to the others on that investment banking weakness, on greater loan loss provisions, even as you are seeing loan growth somewhat and talk of a healthy consumer? It'll be interesting to hear, Tom, color from Jamie Dimon on the call. The media call starts in just about 5 minutes time at 8 a.m. Analyst call at 8:30. What is the commentary from the man himself like, and how does that read through to the men of tomorrow and women? Jane Fraser.
So much coming up here, and again, we'll monitor that call across all of Bloomberg, including Top Live, which you can see on the Bloomberg terminal. Futures give back. We were up a good 20 or so, up 9 now on S&P futures. The VIX 23.91, the yield 2.72%, remarkable. I do want to note oil, Brent crude 106. a gallon. It's really come up nicely. I'll try to get that in a bit. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
We know that it's highly transmissible. We know that 2 doses of vaccines, Pfizer vaccine specifically, neutralize the virus, but not as efficiently, because various studies showing that reduction up to 40-fold, meaning that a 3rd dose is a must for it to successfully neutralize the variant. What we don't know is still that what are the effects of mix and matching between vaccines, and what are the capabilities of antibodies produced from this mix and matching in neutralizing Omicron. Because as we know, many parts of the world use different types of vaccines. And that would be a great data to look at. It will be also great to look at, because majority of the studies done uses a small sample number, and most of the time when you translate it to real world, the data changes. So it will be really good to look at large-scale data of the ability of antibodies from vaccines to neutralize this variant. Grateful here today that the virus, Omicron variant, still uses ACE2 receptor as its main entry. It means that all of the vaccines which are designed with spike in mind still works. Imagine if it uses a different receptor other than ACE2. None of the vaccines would work today. So I think that is the best news that we got from all these studies which came recently, the past couple of days.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
We've really jumped the rails in terms of growth and inflation.
But in our numbers, we've got to the peak of inflation, and we're likely to start to see things come off.
I think broader picture, there's not too much that has, aggressively shifted.
These inflationary pressures mean that the central banks really are going to have to respond here.
The Federal Reserve is going to raise rates until something breaks.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
literal nuts and bolts of inflation and the read-through in earnings. Good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance on Bloomberg Radio and Television. John Farrow, Tom Keene, and Lisa Abramowitz. John Farrow is not in sabbatical. He is merely on vacation and back next week. Kaylee Lyons, as Tom says, drew the short straw. Thank you so much for being with us, Tom. I am looking at a deteriorating tape as we get a confluence of different developments, front and center earnings that really portray the uncertainty and the hit by inflation.
Yeah, the algebra, this is the epsilon on the right-hand side, and the epsilon is like I've never seen. The uncertainty is massive, and you're going to see that in the great observation of Gina Martin-Adams of Bloomberg Intelligence. Lisa, the conference calls, as we will have with J.P. Morgan in moments, the conference calls over the next 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, are everything.
They are, and right now it seems like the signal is being read as negative, even if the actual internals are somewhat positive. If you take a look, for example, J.P. Morgan is down nearly 2%, 1.9%, even after announcing $30 billion of share buybacks, Tom. We are going skeptical. What is it?
Well, I saw Apple the other day, Jim Suva over at Citigroup talking about share buybacks at Apple with their cash flow. And instead of saying, Lisa, that it's going to be gloomy or optimistic on what we see on those conference calls, I'm going to be sector group specific and say some sectors challenged, other sectors, let's go.
And to that point, and I think that it's a really important point, Kaylee, Delta came out with earnings. Their shares flying, right? Up more than 6% ahead of the market. Even as you see JP Morgan down and you see Bed Bath & Beyond, I just keep looking at that and just watching the shares absolutely tank. But Delta, a unique story.
Yeah, a story of still resilient, robust, recovering demand, not just on domestic travel, but international and business travel as well. It's this narrative, Lisa, of moving on from the pandemic crisis into one that maybe the pandemic crisis caused, which is inflationary. And no longer are we talking about COVID-related challenges. Instead, those buzzwords that are going to litter conference calls, as Tom alludes to, inflation, labor, wages, pricing power, supply chains, all of those are going to be what we're looking for this earnings season.
And you talk about the reopening, how everyone wants to get back out, which is the reason why, Tom, it was so shocking yesterday when we saw the incident in Brooklyn. We all are trying to get back to normal, and here we are with yet another crisis hitting a city that's already beset by the pandemic, budget deficits, things that need to get fixed. And it feels like, why do we have to go back to yet another crisis?
It is the delicacy of crime. For those of you internationally and across the nation, we are parsing, as is all others within media, between a suspect and a person of interest, and they're conflating and confusing in the different comments this morning from the MTA, and Mayor Adams making the rounds. He will be with us in this hour. I will quiz him closely, particularly on the surveillance cameras that didn't work, but of course also on the immediate news that he and the New York Police Department and the fire department have as well. An important conversation at this moment of crisis for New York City. Lisa?
And right now we're also, of course, less than a half an hour away from PPI inflation data as well. So a stew of events that we're trying to make sense of. Bear with us as we track it all. What we're tracking in the market is a weakening as we head closer to open, as people assess some of the uncertainties as we parse through earnings. The S&P now down less than 0.2%. The NASDAQ holding in a little bit better than that, of about 0.25%. The euro gaining just a touch, but as Tom has been mentioning, the dollar really ascendant, particularly against the Japanese yen at the highest levels going back 20 years, the lowest level for the yen. 10-year yields dipping just a bit, 2.74%. And crude, really interesting to see that crude is still getting a lift, even though you are seeing some estimates of slowing demand and a more even balance of supply and demand. Parsing through it all, Sam Stovall has been trying to make sense of it, and the degree and the band of uncertainty is definitely sort of mind-blowing. Sam Stovall is Chief Investment Strategist over at CFRA. Sam, what are you focused on in the slew of data, given the earnings that are coming out and painting a very bifurcated picture as far as how they're dealing with inflation?
Well, I think we're getting the news that they are experiencing bottlenecks and that inflation is primarily a concern for this first quarter earnings reporting season. But I think that we probably did see a peak in inflation with the March data. Our expectation is that the 8.5% year-on-year headline CPI will come down to about 5.4% by the end of this year. And also the 10.5 number that we're looking for on PPI will also be coming down quite sharply, mainly also because of easy year comparisons.
Sam Stovall, the Stovall religion is individual stock selection. Let me take it to a sector basis right now. How discrete are the sectors of the Standard & Poor's 500 now? Is it all boats rising or sinking, or is there a real separation?
Well, Tom, there really is a separation right now, certainly in the near term. Just looking at a rolling 200-day moving average relative strength, what we find is there is a definite leaning toward the defensive areas, leadership in the consumer staples, energy, materials, and utilities areas, whereas because of rising interest rates and the negative correlation between the 10-year yield and PE ratios, we're seeing an awful lot of pressure being put on communication services, consumer discretionary, and the information technology area.
Sam, talking of correlation to rates, in theory, higher rates, the prospect of higher interest rates should be helping the banks. And yet we haven't seen that playing out year to date. You have all of these stocks put under pressure into earnings season, which JP Morgan obviously reported this morning. How do you weigh the risk to the financials of potentially a recession coming down the line, which could hurt loan growth, versus potentially better net interest income if the Fed hikes rates? What's your thesis on that group in particular?
Well, the feeling is we're neutral on the group right now. Our belief is that if we're looking at a flattening to inverted yield curve, how are the banks really going to be making an awful lot of money on this net interest income environment? We saw today with JP Morgan Chase that trading was good, but investment banking was down. Also, questions about with inflation and so forth, will we have problems with consumers being able to repay their loans? So I think there are a lot of questions with the financials, and that's going to continue to put pressure on the group.
Sam, every time someone comes on, a strategist looks at this slew of uncertainties and comes out with all the potential changes in the sliding scale. What's your biggest conviction at a time of unprecedented uncertainty?
Biggest conviction is that prices will fluctuate.
Come on, Sam, really?
That feels like a cop-out.
I think that we're still going to be experiencing a bit more pressure to the downside for the overall market. The rally that we got recently, first off, was driven by the defensives, not by the cyclicals. Also, we really didn't have a capitulation that took place at the bottom on March 8th. So I think that we are due for some sort of lower pressure that will end up with a capitulation sell-off before I feel more confident about the second half. Volatility up 61% in the first quarter, and usually about 40% higher in midterm election years, and that's coming true again.
Well, Sam, on the subject of volatility, that just hasn't been limited to the equity market or the bond market. Commodities, it's been wild, oil specifically, and yet I hear time and again from strategists that that's the safe place to hide, that you want to hedge with commodity exposure, with exposure to commodity-tied equities. How confident are you in the ability for those companies or those hard assets to actually play that role given the volatility we are seeing?
I think I'm pretty confident that we are likely to be seeing continued upward movement for equities in the energy space. I mean, expectations are for a more than 250% increase in operating results for this first quarter. Also looking for a 40% gain in revenues and profit margins that are above 10.5%. So good in that area. Materials expected to see a 34% rise in earnings, 16.5% gain in revenues, and profit margins of about 13%. So we're expecting to see these inflation hedges continue to do fairly well.
Sam Stovall, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it this morning here on the beginning of the earnings season. Again, our coverage over a good number of weeks. It's not just about the banks up front. Lisa, I'm going to tear up here. I miss John so much.
I know.
It's just terrible. And, you know, Caprice never looked so good. And while he's gone, seriously, 4 standard deviations on the 2-10 spread from a massive negative 2 standard deviations back out. It's not the end of the world, but what a reversal from curve inversion.
And it tells you something. And what it tells you is short squeeze, big short squeeze. I mean, that's basically what all of the strategists were saying yesterday. How many people were betting on that flattening yield curve? The expectation we're going to get an inverted yield curve imminently as the Fed is expected to over-tighten. And then all of a sudden, on a dime, as people take a look at quantitative tightening, that changes. And how much does that really show the fragility of positioning right now, Tom, perhaps more than any kind of conviction on the longer term horizon?
I love Top Live right now. The JP Morgan call is underway, and I guess the stock has deteriorated a little bit. I mean, Kaylee, you've been following this more than me and Lisa. This morning, the conference calls, I mean, a gajillion people tune in, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. The media call, the analyst call, everyone wants to know what these executives at these banks have to say because they have a very real view on the economic picture. And of course, we're hearing from the CFO in particular, Mr. Barnum, Jeremy Barnum right now, as he's speaking, talking about nickel, Tom. The stock is now down 3.5%.
Look at Max Abelson writing it up. They're grilling these guys on nickel.
Yeah.
JP Morgan on nickel.
They're a
Max
huge player
Abelson,
in the market, Tom.
Max Abelson to the rescue at Top Live. We will continue here. Red and green on the screen. The stocks have given away. VIX back above 24. Where's the 210 spread for John? We'll get it. 35 beats. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world with the first word, I'm Ritika Gupta. The Biden administration is preparing a military aid package worth roughly $750 million for Ukraine. The president is allowed to transfer equipment from U.S. stockpiles without congressional approval in order to speed up delivery during an emergency. The U.S. has provided more than $2.4 billion in military assistance to Ukraine since President Biden took office. Police in New York are searching for what they call a person of interest in the shooting at a Brooklyn subway stop. 23 people were injured, 10 of them shot, and no suspect has been caught. Detectives are looking for a man named Frank James. Keys found at the scene belonged to a U-Haul van that James rented. Police don't know if he was the shooter. In the UK, inflation jumped more than expected last month to a 30-year high. Consumer prices rose in March at an annual rate of 7%, and higher inflation is on the way. This month, there will be a 54% increase in the energy price cap. BlackRock proved resilient to the plunge in stock markets and surging inflation. Investors continue to pour money into the company's long-term funds in the first quarter. Net inflows into those products totaled $114 billion. BlackRock's earnings were better than expected, whilst revenue just missed those estimates. Next week, for the first time in more than a year, passengers on U.S. airlines and public transit will get their chance to travel without a mask. That's if the federal government sticks to its current plan. President Joe Biden is being urged by transportation groups and state and local officials to allow the mask rule to end. Global News 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Everyone you meet in Port Harcourt has stories about what they call black soot, caused by the manufacturing and consumption of these fuel products in the illegal refineries.
Oil theft, known as bunkering, and the refining of its spoils is worsening the damage from decades of fossil fuel exploitation, creating one of the world's most severe ecological disasters.
Our sacred forests, our homes have to give way to oil wells, and no one gets much benefit.
Imagine a resident of Port Harcourt who inhales this soot every second in 24 hours, 7 days a week, 30 days in the month, and for years now, we are dying slowly but surely, and our lifespan is reducing every day.
Mercedes-Benz is on a path towards CO2 neutral mobility. So we have flicked the switch there, and really we're going to step by step electrify everything. And what does that mean? Combustion engines get electrified.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Season is coming.
The bar is pretty high. We're going to see lower earnings growth.
The sentiment on financials has been pretty dour.
Bloomberg breaks the numbers first.
Tesla's gaining on record deliveries for the first quarter.
The industrial sector is getting hit pretty hard.
Every tick down is a big deal.
With exclusive expert analysis.
There are a couple of things that concern us.
We have to break out a different playbook.
There are opportunities out there.
Bloomberg Television and Radio. The fastest numbers and analysis you trust.
Everything changed when Russia invaded Ukraine. That caused a need for a process in Finland to have a discussion about our own security choices. Also a discussion about NATO membership that we are having right now. We are giving today to the Parliament the paper which will analyze different options for Finland.
Extraordinary comments from the Prime Minister of Finland. We heard from Sweden just before that as well. Is Scandinavia and Finland give serious study to leaving neutrality and joining NATO and the European Union in different forms from what we've known from World War II. As you know, on Bloomberg Surveillance, we've done everything we can to speak to experts and to people who have lived so much of continental Europe and this new war. It is our honor now to speak to Nina Khrushcheva, Professor of International Affairs at the New School, with the heritage of her family far and back to World War II. Nina, we don't have time to go into the story of your family coming out of the death of, I believe, your grandfather in World War II, but we can speak to you with your academics at New School, your work at Princeton, of the mind of Vladimir Putin. As we've talked to Angela Stent, you have studied Putin and his affair with not the Russia, the Soviet Union of Khrushchev, but the Russia and Soviet Union of Stalin. What is the distinction of how Vladimir Putin looks at the early Soviet Union?
Well, thank you very much. We know that he doesn't like the early Soviet Union because he thinks it was an interruption of great imperial history when the Soviet Union was trying to become part of its own self, sort of, as Stalin put it, a country within its own nation. So socialism, communism within one taken country. Putin wants to be, and disagree with a lot of experts who say he wants to recreate the Soviet Union. He actually wants to go back into history 1,000 years. And the only reason he's interested in Stalin, or one of the reasons he's interested in Stalin, because Stalin was a gatherer of lands, such as Catherine the Great, such as Peter the Great. So he was a gatherer of lands, and he sees Khrushchev as somebody who gave away those lands. And if you need to be very brutal and very firm and very angry at the world to gather lands, Putin is going to be that.
Mr. Khrushchev was very much affiliated with Poland. In the news this morning, Professor Khrushcheva, is Finland. I refuse to believe that Vladimir Putin will not focus on Finland, given his heritage of Leningrad and St. Petersburg. What is the symbolism to Mr. Putin of this new independence of Sweden and the 800-mile border of Finland?
Well, it is, originally the Russians were saying, well, we're not afraid of Finland and Sweden becoming part of NATO because we have good relationship with them. I think the tone may be changing, but I think what's important here is that Putin trying to prevent NATO from expanding east, in fact, made NATO even more expansional in the east, and that in the east, and that's what should really give them pause. On the other hand, what I also know about Putin is that once you challenge him, he's going to challenge back. So I think that it's about time for Sweden and Finland to think about NATO, because if Putin gets angry, he does get angry, and we do see it. We've seen it, and we do see it in Ukraine now.
Nina, does this end with regime change in Russia?
Well, this is a very terrifying words to say, because we go to prison for this, for even utter those words. No, I don't think it does. It may get less toxic because Putin is toxic, but I do think, what happened now, and we've never seen it before, even under Stalin, because now the KGB over that, security forces, the FSB, and Putin, they are one and the same. Even under Stalin, they were sort of on parallel tracks. Stalin was a brutal dictator, and KGB, it was a different name then, but security forces worked for him. Now Putin works with, he is the security force. And so in this sense, even if the main hydra at the top of it is the main dragon is gone, the system will remain. The system is not going to give itself up. So maybe there would be slightly better relationship with the outside world, but for the Russians, it really doesn't look good inside.
Well, let's talk about inside Russia, Professor. Does domestic feeling within Russia, A, have a bearing on the Kremlin or on Vladimir Putin's decision-making whatsoever, and B, what is that feeling at this moment?
Well, it's really very interesting what happened, because at the beginning it was such a shock on February 24th, and about 50%, more than 50% of the country was just terrified, horrified. And a lot of people went, as you remember, went to protest. And then the state completely regrouped, and basically any word of opposition now became a crime. Everything is a crime. People just stopped in the streets. My niece was arrested 3 times, stopped and asked, why are you here when your passport shows that you live in an entirely different part of Moscow. So it is like that. It's very Stalin-esque right now. And so slowly but surely, with also great propaganda on TV that we are liberating, we the Russians liberate our Ukrainian brothers from the Nazi regime installed by the United States and NATO, then now about 80% support the, as they call it, special operation. The numbers are fudge, but there is a lot of patriotism. Right. And one of the patriotism part is because the sanctions now are not just financial and economic. They are cultural, they are societal, they are humanitarian, and everything. And so Russians have no other choice but to rally around the flag.
Professor, I've got 30 seconds. We saw Vladimir Putin yesterday at the Cosmodrome in the far east of Russia. Is he healthy?
A lot of rumors, once again, a lot of rumors. He doesn't look sick to me, but the people have been stating that the reason he went into Ukraine sort of fall off the cliff so quickly on February 24th is because he's rushing for something. I don't know that, but they're rumors.
Well, Nina Khrushcheva, thank you so much for joining Bloomberg this morning. Professor Khrushcheva at the New School here in New York City, and of course with her heritage across so many decades of the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation as well. Lisa, that was an extraordinary conversation about moving story.
What I think is
Connection
interesting
lost.
is the grip that Vladimir Putin has over all of his security apparatus, and the idea that you can't really divorce the two in the same kind of way that you had in previous administrations. It raises an issue. How does this end?
We're going to see how it ends. We're going to see how inflation ends, too. Michael McKee has entered the studio with his entourage. We're going to look not at CPI, but I believe PPI out today. Red and green on the screen, and really the green gives way to a sense of red. S&P futures now -3. Please stay with us. The mayor of New York City here in about 20 minutes. Good morning.
It's almost the end of the year, but Bali is still quiet and empty. I am here in Kuta Legian, one of the main walking streets here that is used to be a tourist spot for beach, dining, shopping. But many shops here are still closed. Most of the outlets are either for rent or for sale as they have run out of business.
Saya kerjanya di sini udah lama, udah ada 10 tahunan di sini kerja. Masih sepi sih, nggak kayak dulu. Kalau dulu kan rame, sekarang ya ada 1-2 itu ada, tapi nggak kayak dulu. Kalau dulu rame sekali, sekarang paling dapat jualan ya 100, 120 gitu, 200 ya. Kalau dulu sih ya nyampe dah 1 juta, 1,5 tuh nyampe dapat jualan, bisa sampai 2 juta dulu. Sekarang nggak pernah lagi dapat segitu, sama aja. Belum ada turis ke Bali, masih ya domestik aja.
While Bali has reopened its borders for foreign tourists since October, they're still not coming in. Many international airlines are yet to reinstate their direct flight to the island. Balinese people here really hope they can see more people from Australia, China, and Europe to come visit next year.
A lot's happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
The Fed is telling us this is transitory.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
We need to invest in our systems.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
BSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archival concerts. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsor, Bank of America.
Bloomberg Surveillance. Good morning, everyone. The mayor of New York will be with us here in about 15 minutes. An important conversation as we are looking for suspect and a person of interest as well across the 5 boroughs of New York after the Brooklyn shootings yesterday. Economics yesterday, inflation. Michael McKee has a different series this morning. Michael, what do you have?
Well, population pressures have been
inflation are still with us. The producer price index for March shows a stronger than expected gain, up 1.4% on the month. The forecast was for a 1.1% gain. Last month, it was up 0.9%, which is a tick higher than the initial result. On a year-over-year basis, the PPI for final demand comes in unchanged, it looks like.
Yeah, I see an inch there.
Yeah, final demand.
I have no idea what that number means.
Take out food and energy, and the core rate up 9.2% on the year. That's much stronger than the 8.4% last month. The other thing to look at here is the index for goods versus services. Index for final demand goods up 2.3% in March, while for services up just 0.9%. We saw the goods in the CPI decline in March as services rose, but that is not the case in the pipeline.
Right. Let me get a question to you, Mike. I think it's really important here. PPI, you and I are old enough to remember when this was a huge deal. Is it a huge deal again? It basically contributes to the ongoing belief that we are in an inflationary cycle and the Fed has to move. Yesterday, Tom Barkin of Richmond strengthened his view, saying we should move very quickly to neutral. He's sort of joining the Jim Bullard camp and then see what happens. What have you learned in 24 hours about the duration of this inflation? When you look at core 6-ish, PPI core 9-ish, how has Michael McKee's sense of the duration of this bout of inflation changed?
Looks like it's going to take quite a while to bring it down. I mean, we may have reached the peak in CPI.
Quite a while, like when the Red Sox start winning, or
what? Well, let's hope they start picking up the pace a little bit sooner than inflation.
Mike, I do want to just tell you, we were looking at what that number would be for the PPI final demand. It took a while to come in. It did come in 11.2%. The expectation was 10.6%. We are seeing markets respond somewhat in the way you would expect, with yields up slightly. Not a massive reaction, but still, we are seeing the S&P futures erase gains. And we're looking right now at a market with a new inflationary dynamic affecting the pipeline, as you said, 11.2%, Mike. Can you put that into perspective?
Well, it's the most since 2010, which is better, I suppose, than the 1981 number from yesterday, although they changed the PPI calculations around that time, so we don't go as far back. But it does just suggest that there are still strong pipeline pressures, which doesn't surprise anybody, given the fact that we're seeing all kinds of interruptions to supply lines and interruptions to agriculture from the war in Europe, and so a lot going on that pressures prices. One other number I wanted to mention today, and if we can bring this up, the MBA mortgage application is not something we follow on a regular daily basis because it's very high frequency data, down another 1.3% last week. But the thing that is really interesting about it is that as expected, it falls as rates rise, but more and more people, 25%, are switching into adjustable rate mortgages. Now, that could be because they're about a percentage point cheaper now than the fixed rate mortgage, but over the next couple of years, if the Fed follows Tom Barkin and Jim Bullard's advice and we end up at 3 or 4%, is this a bet by the American people that the Fed will be able to bring inflation down and will be cutting rates before their arms reset?
Michael McKee, thank you so much. CPI, PPI, tomorrow there'll be a third inflation series that McKee will dive in on as well. We get a perspective, a changed perspective on the American economy. Kathleen Buss-Johnson joins us right now. We are thrilled for that here with mixed moments in the market. Kathy, thank you so much for joining us from Oxford Economics. Kathy, what has changed for you on the duration of high inflation in the last 24 hours?
Thanks, Tom. Happy to be with you. The numbers really just confirm our view that we've had for a while now, that inflation is intolerably high, and you're hearing that from Fed officials. That's why they're saying we need to get to neutral quickly and then actually move to restrictive. Now, we're going to debate whether the peak in inflation for consumer prices, that is in, whether it was March or April or May, and we think it's probably April, but nevertheless, the real issue is how quickly does it decelerate? And there, I think most believe it's going to be much more gradually than previously thought. And we still see headline inflation still above 5% by the end of the year. So yes, it's a bit of a reprieve, but still really high and uncomfortably high for the Federal Reserve.
Kathleen, can you help us understand the connection between PPI and CPI? Basically, the prices that consumers pay in stores when they go out to eat versus the prices that producers have to pay, and how much that directly gets passed through to future inflation that people feel in the grocery store or when they go on a vacation. What do we have a sense of how direct and what the time is for that transmission?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, what we have seen in this business cycle, Lisa, that's really different than the prior decade is that corporate America has really strong pricing power. So let's say if we went back 5, 6 years ago, you would have wholesale prices would have went up. But corporations would have had a hard time passing it on to consumers, and it would have eroded profit margins. Now we're not really seeing that, right? Earnings, I know you've been speaking a lot about earnings for the last few days. We're going to get the next quarterly earnings data rolling out. But up until this point, earnings have actually been quite good, and that's helped fuel the equity market. That's because corporate America has pricing power, and we see that in many surveys.
But Kathy, are we starting to reach the limits of that? Lisa has brought it up a few times during this show. Bed Bath & Beyond disappointing, facing inflationary pressure, supply chain headwinds, and a headline just coming out from the company. They see a slowdown in consumer demand. If demand starts to deteriorate, consumers start to push back against higher prices, are less tolerant of it. Is that the point we're at now?
We may be, and that is the critical point of this cycle, right? We all know we're late cycle. How late are we in the cycle, and how much pressure on corporate profits, right? So if you see input costs still rising, as the PPI data suggests, unit labor costs, we know wage gains are still high. If companies are no longer able to pass it on as easily to consumers, then it is going to start to bite into corporate profit margins. There's no way around that, and we may be reaching that point now. The consumers to us still look like they're in really good shape, but remember, they don't have that fiscal stimulus, right? The checks that were given out a year ago, that's gone, and now you really have to rely on private wage gains to really carry you through, and the excess savings. The real question really for all of us when we forecast and look at this is how much of that, $2.7 trillion worth of accumulated savings does the consumer rely on?
Kathy, we're also talking about an inflation surge stemming from commodities, and this often has been thought of as something that's temporary, transient, pick your poisonous word. How much is that changing in an era where it does seem like we are deglobalizing, and it seems like these shocks are all having the same impact, even though they are very different in nature?
Yeah, that is something that could play out, over the medium to long term, and it is a real potential game changer to the backdrop. That globalization really brought in disinflationary forces where it kind of capped overall price gains. If that's changing and fraying on the ends, which it looks like it may be, that is a very different scenario. Doesn't necessarily, it's hard to say where exactly oil prices or copper, where that will play out. But what we can say is that that disinflationary impulse could be behind us.
Kathleen Bostjancic, thank you so much, with Oxford Economics today on 2 reports on inflation. Lisa, I love what you said. I believe it was a final demand inflation of 11%. That's a wow statistic. I don't even know what to do with it.
11.2%. We don't have data that goes back as far. In this series, it goes back to 2010, but it is the highest going back to that. And the pace of increase is the fastest since November of last year. Well, that isn't that long. To just think about the acceleration from the already accelerated levels that we saw back then because of the pandemic disruptions highlights shock upon shock upon shock. When do you price this in, not as temporary, but something more permanent? We're going to talk about that coming up with Michael Purvis, founder and CEO at Talbot Capital. Thank you. I'm trying.
He's very good on Pacific Rim as well.
You're trying to influence the yen. Honestly, it is an important point, but it really highlights this new moment. Remember when central banks were most worried about actually weakening their currencies to try to keep their economies afloat? That's been shifted completely because of the inflationary backdrop. And Tom, that is a narrative that we see playing out in earnings as they worry about that inflation really more than anything else.
And then the back half of the show is on the 30-year auction, correct?
Really? Yes, correct. We're going to blow out the rest of the day. We're just going to do 30-year auction.
I can
talk about past auctions, future auctions, meanings of auctions.
Yeah.
You know, what is the level of a yield when we're looking at inflation that feels unmoored, at least in the near term?
What are we learning on a JP Morgan calls? I think the stock was south-ish off the call as well. Kaylee?
Down 3.6% right now as that analyst call is now underway. They're giving some color on equity underwriting really being heard in Americas and in EMEA. That, of course, is related to the investment banking that disappointed, Tom. But when it comes to those loan loss provisions, that's where it comes back to the inflation issue that companies are facing that Lisa is talking about. $1.5 billion, a massive jump as the bank is trying to hedge risk around inflation, around geopolitics. JP Morgan is not going to be alone in that, and I'm interested to see how the color shakes out for tomorrow's banks and Monday with Bank of America as well on that issue, Tom.
On Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television, let me do a data check here as we launch toward a conversation with the mayor of New York City. Red and green on the screen. A better tape earlier gives way. The VIX now again above 24. That is of note. An ascendant dollar in for global Wall Street today. Certainly a weaker yen has given a response from the Bank of Japan as well. The 10-year yield, well, it's back to 2.73% of PPI data. Coming up, a conversation with the mayor of New York.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world with The First Word, I'm Ritika Gupta. Police are looking for someone they call a person of interest in the worst attack in the history of the New York City subway system. 10 people were shot and 13 others were hurt in an early morning attack on a subway train in Brooklyn. Detectives are searching for Frank James. They don't know if he was the shooter. They say keys found at the scene of the attack belonged to a U-Haul van that James rented. President Biden has significantly ramped up his condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He now describes Russia's actions as genocide. The president later stood by his comments but said that lawyers would ultimately make the official determination. Meanwhile, the U.S. is preparing a package of $750 million worth of military aid for Ukraine. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen will warn governments that, in her words, are sitting on the fence over the international effort to punish Russia. In an excerpt of her speech she's giving today, Yellen says the coalition of sanctioning countries will not be indifferent to actions that undermine the sanctions. She also says the sanctions aren't motivated by just one country's foreign policy objectives. Shares of Delta Airlines are rising. The carrier expects a strong rebound in summer travel bookings that will help it overcome rising fares and bounce back from a first quarter loss. CEO Ed Bastian says Delta has seen record sales heading into the spring. And the world's largest seller of luxury goods defied disruptions from the war in Ukraine and a resurgence of COVID in China. LVMH posted strong revenue growth in the first quarter. Sales were up some 23%, led by Louis Vuitton and Dior. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on a Bloomberg Quick Take. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
Companies now, they're getting hundreds, maybe even thousands of applications. So software has come in to automate the process.
You want to write your resume for robots, not for humans. The only job your resume has is to be comprehensible, to the software that is reading it, because that software or robot is going to decide whether or not a human ever gets their eyes on it.
These things are programmed by a certain segment of the population that might not be totally inclusive or not be fully aware.
Concerns about how this technology could exacerbate discrimination. For the FTC, I think foremost, the FTC needs to be making sure that we're fully understanding this technology.
We don't trust companies to self-regulate when it comes to pollution. We don't trust them to self-regulate when it comes to workplace comp. Why on earth would we trust them to self-regulate AI?
Wherever you get your news.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak with Lee.
On Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg Technology. This is Bloomberg Green.
On TV, radio, and the web, this is Bloomberg. Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg Terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds.
I'm here at the Delhi airport, and behind me you can see SpiceJet's 737 MAX aircraft. SpiceJet in form of cash and aircraft. There's a big celebration happening at the Gwalior airport. As you can see, they've literally rolled down the red carpet for SpiceJet chairman Ajay Singh. There are balloons, there are flowers. This is a big deal for SpiceJet because it is the only Indian operator of Boeing 737 MAX planes currently.
Stocked early enough all these precious materials you were just mentioning, and we were on the lucky side that our prognosis was spot on in a way, forecasting what kind of material we would need and what quantity we would need.
I'm committing the full resources of our state to fight this surge of crime, this insanity that is seizing our city, because we want to get back to normal. It has been a long, hard 2 years. That's what we crave, that sense of stability and normalcy. And this is what the mayor and I are going to continue to work toward.
The gentlelady from Buffalo, Kathy Hochul there, the governor of New York, with her comments on crime, of course, front and center in this city, and frankly, for Governor Hochul across the state. We welcome all of you on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television across this nation, around the world, to a conversation with Eric Adams. He is the New York City mayor. I might point out a captain of the New York Police Department as well. He's been making the media rounds this morning. Mayor, right to it on this day after this horror. It's very simple. On WNYC in the recent minutes, you perhaps shifted from calling a person of special interest to now a formal suspect. You know that distinction. Is Mr. James a suspect?
Yes, he is. He is a suspect based on the briefing from my law enforcement officials and based on the evidence that we were able to accumulate. He has now been upgraded to a suspect, and we're asking all New Yorkers to assist us in his apprehension. Please do not approach him. If you see him or if you know about his, whereabouts, please notify law enforcement.
Well, Mayor, through the Bloomberg abilities, we have that ABC has just announced, and let me quote exactly, Mr. Mayor, New York City subway shooting suspect Frank James in custody. That according to ABC. Can you tell us what you and all of your staff have learned about Mr. James in the last 6 or 7 hours?
Well, this is moving and it's extremely fluid. There's a host of evidence that we have been recovering. The NYPD, the FBI, as well as our state law enforcement entities have all collaborated together. I cannot say enough about the fast work that you are witnessing. They had to piece together this case from the van arrival here to the city, to the devices, to the things that we collected. They're doing a great job in bringing this person to justice.
Mayor, I want to talk here about what we're going to do, as Governor Hochul said, about crime. You know the numbers in Chicago. You don't know the numbers here. I would say that you are arguably the most qualified politician in the nation with your experience from Bushwick years ago out to where you are now to talk about this. First, on cameras, in amendments and civil liberties and all that. London is covered with cameras after terror events. Is this the tipping point where New York City, 1/5 of the cameras of London, begins to monitor the public like London?
Well, I think that I have been talking about this since the time I took office in January. I sent my deputy mayor of public safety across the globe to find out how are we protecting human beings throughout the entire globe. And we are not going to sit back and allow this technology to exist and not protect the people of the city. And we're going to continue to explore it.
Mayor Adams, you also had put more police forces into subway stations to protect the people of the city, given that this is just one in a series of events that have unfolded over the last year during the pandemic, even in subway stations, acts of violence. Clearly that failed yesterday. I know you've said you complete looking more like a failure, less like anything of semblance of a passing grade.
Well, we should be clear. We've been here before as New Yorkers. You know, I often talk about my mid-'80s when I started in the transit police, ironically. And I'm aware of what it takes to turn around generational poverty, generational crises that feed violence in our cities. And then we cannot ignore the overproliferation of guns. No, NYPD, my administration has not failed. We have removed 1,800 guns off the streets of our cities since being elected. Just think about that.
Mayor Adams, I don't mean to interrupt, but I know you have to go to an incredibly important day. And of course, the announcement of ABC that Mr. James is in some form of custody. One final question. Mayor Adams, you are expert at the study of gangs. On January 4th, you stated, you showed up at a press conference and said, we got to do something about gangs. These kids, 3 dead in the last 24 hours, not the headlines like Brooklyn, but 3 dead on Gates Avenue, on Etna Avenue, on Laconia Avenue. What are we going to do about the gangs that pull these kids into crime and violence?
Got to zero in. It's called precision policing, not just throwing out a wide net, but having a precision approach to those who are trigger pullers and violent gangs. That is at the heart of our crises.
Mayor Adams, finally, as we've been mentioning, the reports from ABC that Frank James, the suspect in the shooting, is now in custody. Can you confirm that for us?
Well, I'm here on the air with you right now, and I'm pretty sure that apprehension had to have taken place by the time I sat down in this chair. We will make that confirmation once my NYPD officials let me know.
Mayor Adams, thank you so much. Greatly appreciated today.
Thank you.
Eric Adams, he is the mayor of New York City, of Manhattan, the boroughs, and his Brooklyn as well. We're waiting Shelley Banjo, our Bloomberg News New York bureau chief. She and her team have been on top of this story with a real national and global research bent as well. She will move forward. Kelly, really something there to see that ABC headline is, I believe, Mr. James reported in custody.
Yep, Frank James, who, of course, as we understand, no longer just the person of interest. He is now the suspect in the shooting that took place yesterday, Tom. And we understand as well from previous remarks that the mayor had made on his loop through the networks this morning, the assumption at this point, there is no evidence to indicate that the shooter was acting with anyone in coordination. It seems at this time that he was acting alone. So it raises the question of whether the threat to the 5 boroughs of New York is now over at this time. Clearly, though, there will still be a stepped-up presence of police forces and security in subway stations throughout the city today.
To review the camera question that I asked the mayor, I was stunned in my research this morning, folks, of course, of the dominance of China with surveillance cameras. I don't think there's any surprise there. We all know that in our travels to China. But then after that is truly the dominance of London front and center, and Delhi a little bit in there as well. But London front and center with almost 5 times as many cameras as what we see in New York. And you wonder, as we spoke to Mayor Adams, Kaylee, if this will be a sea change moment for how we attack and monitor with modern technology.
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. And these are questions that have been raised in the last 24 hours since the shooting that took place during rush hour just about 24 hours ago. Of course, people now have to commute back in on this Wednesday morning, Tom, and it raises a question as well, given that this was not an isolated event in terms of violent crime on New York City's transit system, what the broader ramifications are of a New York that is trying to come back, bring people back into the office out of the pandemic work from home era. Where does New York go from here? Eric Adams, of course, starting to answer some of those questions for us.
The delicacies that I mentioned, the January 4th meeting, let me make clear, this is a newly minted mayor. I mean, you know, his badge for the city of New York still smelled of the plastic like any new badge. And out of nowhere, he showed up in an important press conference on gangs. And in my discussions, folks, in New York, there's always been a pride that maybe New York City did not have the gang structures of other cities around the nation. Kaylee, you've got to believe as well that will be front and center in the coming days.
Absolutely, and not just in New York City, Tom. We have to remember that Eric Adams in his remarks last night framed this as a national issue about a gun violence problem in America, largely in cities across America. So it's not just about the New York response here, the local response, the state response. What is the federal government's role in this? What is the Biden administration, who was just taking action on ghost guns earlier this week? How does the administration, how does Pennsylvania Avenue move forward in this moment?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see the federal tie-in here, as Anne-Marie Horton talked about earlier this morning, Kaylee. You really got to wonder how that stepped up. And what I find so tragic is this horrifically large Brooklyn affair of yesterday and the other shootings around the nation in the last recent days. And there it is, the New York Post today, buried within all of New York City media, of 3 dead and a large number wounded overnight. And what's so scarier, Kaylee, is those dead in the geography of the New York Post article was 4, 5, 6 locations of violence.
Yeah, and Tom, it speaks to the point that this is just one incident in a broader scheme of rising crime in New York City. Felony crimes, a basket of them, up 44% just year to date, just in 2022, Tom, and it's already April. And to your point on mass shootings across the country, in April, 19 mass shootings, which of course is defined by 4 or more people being shot and injured, have taken place across the country. So this is not an event that can be viewed entirely in isolation, I think.
I mentioned there in our conversation with the mayor, you know, okay, folks, I editorialized. It was the first time Kaylee Lines has ever seen me editorialize. Read the mayor's Wikipedia, whether you agree with his politics or not, whatever. It is an extraordinary testament to coming out of really abject poverty in Brooklyn, struggling, massively screwing up, including being a gang member of the 7 Crowns, and then Eric Adams, to be direct, got his act together, really starting as a traffic cop for New York City and then moving on to becoming captain of the New York Police Department. Let me do a data check right now. Kaylee, why don't you pick up with your comments?
Well, on the subject of data, we have seen risk sentiment rolling over, Tom. Right now, futures are flat, if not lower, on S&P 500 futures, on NASDAQ 100 futures as well. Of course, in the context of everything else going on, it is earnings season. You have JP Morgan moving to the downside in pre-market trading after misses on investment banking and a big leg up in provisions for loan losses, $1.5 billion on that front. So JP Morgan is moving lower. When it comes to the bond market, of course, we also are dealing with an 11 handle on producer price inflation here in the United States, 11.2% in March. Not a lot of action in the bond market, still sitting at 273 on the 10-year yield, Tom.
Kaylee, thank you so much. One of the great joys of doing this is I have a team behind me. It's not 20 or 30, the normal entourage that we have here on Bloomberg Surveillance. It is 1,900 reporters, and what we know is that we can parse out the people grinding out in journalism who write piercing notes and piercing questions. Shelley Banjo, our New York bureau chief, did that for me earlier this morning. I was stunned at the acuity of your notes overnight. Give me one vignette from our reporters of what you learned.
I think that the city is on edge, that this is quite a pivotal moment for the city. And the mayor is trying to, figure out how to respond to this and also, get people to go on the subways.
If I could just jump in, because we were mentioning a few minutes ago the headline out of ABC that Frank James had been apprehended, had been arrested. ABC is now correcting that. It was a mistake. They were just now breaking the news that he is now the suspect, not just a person of interest, which of course Eric Adams was able to confirm for us. He was not able to confirm that that suspect was in custody, and ABC now saying that in fact he is not, Tom.
That is an important correction, to say the least. And this is what officers of the law and mayors of the politics have to deal with, the cacophony of the media. This is your fault, Shelley. The immediacy of modern news is just appalling. We correct as we go.
Of course, and this is kind of what it also adds to the anxiety of keeping people on edge. Is he caught? Where is he? What's going on? Should I take the subway? This is not a city that feels at ease at the moment.
Well, we don't feel at ease, and the sirens echoing across the 5 boroughs last night. It was really shocking to see. Is there any presumption that Mr. James, as a suspect, is within the 5 boroughs with his affiliations to Philadelphia, Milwaukee, or frankly just leaving the city?
I think this is a nationwide search at this point because, you mentioned the ties to Wisconsin to Philadelphia. We don't know exactly where he is at the moment. And so not only is the New York Police Department looking into this, but also working with national authorities as well.
Well, and Shelley, what can any New Yorkers who, now that it's 9 a.m. New York time, who need to go into the office, what should they expect to see if they are traveling via public transit today? What kind of presence by police or other security forces?
So yesterday, Mayor Adams said that they were going to double the police officers in the stations and doing their sweeps. It's unclear whether or not that continued today, but it's safe to say you can see an increased police presence as you are commuting to work. You saw a number of New Yorkers, including Governor Kathy Hochul, ride the subway, tweet about it, make sure people know, we're going back, we're getting back to life on the subway, and to kind of try to keep that energy alive.
Shelley Banjo with us of Bloomberg News, and of course running all of our New York City operation. We welcome all of you on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television to a movable feast of news on this tragedy in Brooklyn. And of course, we must correct the headline from ABC that was put out stark and clear about 15 minutes ago. We spoke to Mayor Adams about that incorrect headline. Mr. James is a suspect. He is not in custody, to be clear. Shelley Banjo, I want to talk about the absolute fury across all political persuasions, and we saw it in the election, and that is politicians, but with no aspersion to Mayor Adams or Governor Hochul, we have thoughts and prayers. Are we beyond thoughts and prayers to action about crime?
Yeah, this is the 41st mass shooting in New York City since the pandemic started. Even though we're at decades lows for crime across many categories, shootings are up. Now, Mayor Adams rose to power, staked his election, staked his administration, staked his first 100 days on reducing crime, but he is mostly focused on policing.
This is a distinction that's so important. We have increased crime. Every city has it. New York City has it. It's no different. Are we going to say this is social issues, or are we going to say something that you hear from the conservative right, that the bad guys are now out on the street? And I'm thinking Tom Menino vintage Boston of 30, 40 years ago. Put them in jail. Where is that tone with Mayor Adams and other mayors?
Yeah, there's no doubt this has turned into a political issue, and it will get even more political as the rhetoric heats up ahead of the midterms later, this year. Adams has taken the stance of let's put more police on the ground to solve these issues. He has kind of made, gestures toward things like housing, homelessness, other kind of issues as unemployment issues as well. Talked about addressing those root causes. But so far, the actions that he has taken have been along policing.
What does the New York Police Department recommend?
The New York Police Department is going along with Adams. Adams this is his number one issue, and you've seen
He has their support, to be clear.
Well, it's hard to characterize the entire force in terms of supporting for Adams.
Not that Tom Keene would make generalizations. I'm in the banjo timeout chair right now.
No. I mean, he's put in place a whole bunch of new leaders that are loyal to him and are put in place to carry out his will. So far, the police, you've heard. Show of support for Adams and for these issues, as long as it is done, well and conscientiously.
Shelley, obviously there has been a conversation about policing writ large in America for several years now, with police brutality, of course, being one of the issues. There was the defund the police movement. What solutions are on the table outside of strictly policing as a way to get violence and crime under control?
Well, you are starting to see a return from Adams of the broken windows concept, this idea of let's go after the small crimes, the fare jumpers, the window washers, those kinds of things. We have not seen positive effects from a social justice perspective from those kinds of actions. And so it's going to be a tightrope to walk. Adams says, well, it's not going to be like that under me. I was that cop fighting for justice for, Black and brown New Yorkers and people of color and people of low-income neighborhoods. So he's trying to say, because of his background, that it won't resort to those kinds of things. Now, we're also seeing things in the recent New York State budget around mental health, around child care, around homelessness and housing. Those are those kind of long-term issues that just, take more than 100 days to solve.
Shelley, the heart of this is a political process of a history. And any reading of Gotham will tell you that this is nothing new in New York City. The only city I can compare to New York City is Shanghai for the commercial variance of it across the 5 boroughs in all. In terms of what Mayor Adams wants to get done here in a New York way, how much does he need the support of a fractious city council?
He needs the support. Right now, it's still unclear. The city council, on the, kind of from a visible standpoint, they look like they should be opposed to him. They're, majority women, people of color, people of
That's what I understand. Wait. He's a person of color and grew up dirt poor in Brooklyn, and he doesn't have their support? Well, who else is going to get their support?
He is a person of color who grew up dirt poor, but is also very in tune with the interests of the real estate business, which, aren't necessarily at odds with progressives, but when it comes to increasing money for affordable housing and homelessness and mental health, putting more money toward those social services, those things tend to be at odds sometimes.
Well, Shelley, while we're talking about socioeconomic strata, let's also talk about where this happened in Sunset Park in Brooklyn, the demographics of that area, a large part of them in a lower income bracket. The subway is the economical choice when you are trying to move about through New York City. If the subways aren't secure, do the people in this area or other areas similar to it from a demographic perspective have any other options?
No, and that's the thing. You hear a lot of people saying, oh, I'm going to take an Uber at night. Well, $40, $50, take an Uber home from Manhattan to Sunset Park, $60, $70 sometimes, isn't feasible for most of the people in those neighborhoods. A lot of the people injured that Governor Kathy Hochul met with yesterday were in their teens, going to work, going to school. Those are people who don't have those kinds of options. Now, that gas canister might have gone off anywhere along that train line. It could have landed in Times Square if he had made it all the way up to Manhattan. It happened to be in that subway station, a major thoroughfare in the middle of the morning commute. And that's what made this thing so horrific. It wasn't just a shooting in a neighborhood where people expect shootings to occur. It was on the subway system, which is supposed to be a safe place.
I want to talk about that in a moment. Shelley Banjo with us, folks, encyclopedic on the 5 boroughs. She is the New York bureau chief for Bloomberg News. We welcome all of you on radio and television. I know our Michael Barr on Bloomberg Radio is going into the details here of the confusion, the correction of ABC over the arrest of a suspect. That is incorrect. If you've seen that, Mr. James, I believe, is now moved from person of interest to suspect. But we do welcome all of you nationwide and around the world on radio, on television. Lisa Bramowitz, Kaylee Lyons, and Tom Keenan with us again. Shelley Banjo. I want to go back to this really, really important point of when we move from the politics of media in moments to solving problems for people who aren't visible. I was thunderstruck this morning at how alone the New York Post article was of the crime blotter you follow every day, Shelley, last night. 3 dead, X amount wounded. To be blunt, folks, with respect for the Windy City, it read like Chicago gang wars because it was a wide set of geographies that fancy people like me never attend. Tell us about the tension Mayor Adams faces with poorer people in this city who face this every single night.
Yeah, those are the people who voted for him. I mean, Adams didn't win the vote in Manhattan. He won the vote of the outer boroughs of people of low incomes with a wide majority. And these are the people that voted for him, asking him to help clean up some of these neighborhoods, get guns off the streets. So this is, you know, his promise to the people who elected him. In his series of interviews he gave about his first 100 days, he gave himself a grade of incomplete. So he's saying, give me some more time. People who were injured yesterday, people who regularly take that subway stop say, you know, I've kind of run out of patience for time.
All of us, Shelley, here are foreigners in this great city, except for one person on team surveillance, and that is Lisa Abramowitz. She's after the first drink, the accent shifts. I can't understand a word she's saying. Lisa Abramowitz, good morning again.
Good morning. Honestly, because of that background of mine, full disclosure, I have a different approach to this because I grew up in New York City in the 80s and 90s. It was a very different city then, right? I mean, so when we put crime into perspective, we're going in the wrong direction. We are nowhere near where it was in the 1980s or even the early 1990s. Nevertheless, Tom, I keep coming back to this. You know, you don't want to see it go in the wrong direction when you feel like you're on the precipice of a sea change when it comes to office space and people coming back. And that is the lens, Tom, that I see us viewing this through, which is a reason why it's so important, especially as we look at bank earnings, as we look at what the future is going to be over the next few months. The city, the biggest, the most dynamic in the United States, facing a new world, right? And are we going to make it better, or are we going to see it revert back to what we saw in the 1980s and 1990s?
We're going to see that as well. I have, Shelley, an image of my childhood. This is my youth. This is a few years ago, of looking out on essentially a Gene Hackman set at the Port Authority of the war zone with great respect to Rudy Giuliani that he and others began to rectify. Where are we in that shift right now? All of us in our heads have shifts, and frankly, this goes back to LaGuardia and the rest, where New York does make a shift. Is this an event where Mayor Adams could advance a shift?
I think he could pounce on this to get more of his agenda done, that's for sure. I think you do have a groundswell of support saying, okay, what are you going to do now? And so if he pounces on this moment to kind of push ahead more of his agenda, I think you could certainly see that. You know, it's to Lisa's earlier point, it is a generational shift. You have a generation of people who grew up in New York City, bankers, lawyers, who grew up thinking this was a playground where I could walk around, look at my phone on the subway and not look up until I got to my subway stop. That's not how people in the 70s and 80s operated. They were not looking down at their phones. They were looking around. They were, you know, looking at their, surroundings, making sure that there was nothing there. Now? Well, I think you see people changing their behavior. They're not standing right at the subway platform. They're not,
Shelley, we didn't have phones back then. So there is that aspect, right? We actually had to not be on screens. But there is an issue of the New Yorker and sort of the ability to shrug it off. And that has been sort of the zeitgeist. If you take a look at a lot of the people going to the subways, what are people looking for in terms of some sort of administrative response? What are businesses looking for in terms of assurances that the city isn't moving completely in the wrong direction?
I think businesses want to know that the leadership is taking it seriously, and Adams has said that. And so now they want to see, okay, well, what kind of actions are you taking toward that? What are you putting toward that? We'll have an interesting data point come up in the next couple of weeks, and that's the New York City budget. How much money are you going to allocate toward policing or public safety? Not just that, but how much money are you going to allocate some of the root causes of some of these issues around mental health and other issues that are plaguing New York City? Now, in this instance, it looks like this suspect wasn't even from New York City. He came from somewhere else, and that's another issue, and that's a federal issue as well.
Shelley, let's talk about from somewhere else. We've talked a lot about how this impacts New Yorkers. What about non-New Yorkers, tourism, visitors from around the country, around the world who come to New York, who are likely seeing these headlines and watching this unfold? How can that economically, when it comes to tourism and that aspect of it, impact New York City?
It's probably the worst thing to happen right now for international tourism. We're just starting to see international tourists come back, go to Broadway, take in shows, go to concerts. And I think for a lot of people, they're going to say, you know what, that just happened. Let me go next year. And that is a huge source of revenue for New York City. And those jobs, those tourism jobs, still haven't come back. The jobs, the revenue, the profits for the banks, for law firms, for tech companies, those have roared back. But for the issues around tourism, restaurants, theater, and entertainment, they still haven't.
Shelley Banjo, thank you so much. I know it's been an exceptionally busy day for you. Shelley Banjo with Bloomberg News and our New York bureau chief. We are with you at this moment without interruption. Kaylee Lyons, Tom Keene, and Lisa Abramowitz as we move on a multiple front of stories. Futures are -4. I guess dollar ascendant is what we can tell you of the Bloomberg, the world of economics, finance, and investment, but really pushed aside. And yes, with our focus in New York City on the Brooklyn shootings, there is Ukraine. It has been eventful in Sweden and Finland today. With more, Anne-Marie Horton in Washington. Anne-Marie?
Hey, Tom, how are you doing this morning? So we have heard from Finland and Sweden in terms of the direction of travel and really painting a picture of how these two countries, which have kind of kept an open door policy into joining NATO, could potentially do so, and how they are mapping out those security risks right now, with Finland coming out with this white paper that there's been a lot of speculation about. We should note it's a tectonic shift in terms of the polls in both these countries, in terms of the individuals and parties which have usually been against such a move, actually moving towards that direction. And it also comes as the United States, Tom, has really changed the rhetoric, with the president yesterday most notably calling what is going on in Ukraine genocide. And we just got the Kremlin response saying that allegation is, quote, unacceptable distortion.
Anne-Marie, I want to go to your expertise with Vladimir Putin. You've always played this down in your career, but you've got more than a nodding acquaintance traipsing across the 42 time zones of Russia. I look up yesterday, and there's Mr. Putin with his first sighting at the Cosmodrome way out near Vladivostok and the Pacific shores. What did you make of the Putin sighting yesterday, and what does that say about him and his new military's effort in Ukraine?
Well, it was really what he said yesterday. One, he pretty much put an end to the peace talks, saying that they are a dead end, and he blamed those on Ukraine in terms of those peace talks that Turkey has been brokering. And then he also talked about and almost admitted that they are moving in the direction that the United States officials, Ukrainian military officials, have been telling us in the world, which is they are not going against after trying to capture Kiev, and they're just going to move to more tactical advances in eastern Ukraine. This is what President Putin signaled yesterday. So what he's saying is that there is no peace agreement that he sees in the short term, and that they will be able to conquer, or at least accomplish what they call their special military operation. And he is strictly really focusing on eastern and southern Ukraine, especially the Donbass region.
We're speaking with Anne-Marie Horton of Bloomberg News amid a sea of news when we have the backdrop of the war in Ukraine and the horrific images and the reality of reopening to a wounded world that has that looks very different in terms of budget deficits and certain changed landscapes. I do wonder, Anne-Marie, especially as we get earnings, all of the cacophony of news, we are looking at disruptions that seem to be persisting. And when it comes to the Ukrainian war, especially given what you just said about Vladimir Putin, it seems like it is going to be hard to get a resolution in the short term. What is the long-term plan for the U.S. government, for the Western allies, given the disruption to commodity worlds, given the images that are horrific on a humanitarian level?
I'm glad you brought this up, Lisa, because there's two big disruptions. Well, two in terms of you have what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, and then also these lockdowns that are persisting in China that are massive supply chain disruption that this administration is going to have to deal with. But when you look at disruptions due to the war in Ukraine, the two big ones are energy and food security. And a lot of that food security is coming in this region. We're talking about wheat and we're talking about corn. These are the issues the U.S. and their European and other allies around the world are trying to make sure they can make up for. It is very difficult because Russia and Ukraine, in terms of food, play an outsized role. And then, of course, Russia plays another outsized role when it comes to the likes of oil, gas, etc. But if the shelling and atrocities continue, you already see Europe moving into the direction they're talking about, even if it's on the margins, putting sanctions on Russian oil and gas.
Well, and as we talk about energy and food security and sanctions on Russian gas, that leads to energy and food prices. Anne Marie, just less than an hour ago, we got an 11.2% read on producer price inflation in America, following the 8.5% read on CPI. How are the politics of inflation playing for President Biden right now, who continues to call this Putin's price hike?
It's incredibly difficult for the administration, and we're also on the heels, of course, of what happened yesterday in New York City. And this really paints the picture of the hurdles facing the administration as we gear up for the midterm elections. Crime, keeping cities safe, and bringing costs down, inflation. The CBS poll over the weekend, more than 60% on crime, inflation, immigration, and the economy disapprove of the administration. So obviously, these are two massive focus points. The president said yesterday, which brought us to our top of discussion, your family budget, your ability to fill up your tank, none of it should hinge on whether a dictator declares war and commits genocide a half a world away. Will the quote-unquote Putin's price hike, will that resonate with the electorate? It hasn't really so far.
Emery Horton with us here with an extended conversation this morning. We welcome all of you on radio and television to Bloomberg Surveillance, folded over to the Open. John Farrow is on sabbatical. Lisa Bramowitz, Tom Keeney, Kaylee Lyons with you. And, of course, the news has been extraordinary on too many fronts. We're going to continue here with Anne-Marie Horton on her Washington. We did speak with the mayor of New York City within the confusion of an incorrect headline from ABC announcing the arrest of a suspect, Mr. Frank James, in the Brooklyn shootings. That is incorrect. We want to make that clear. The suspect has been named as Frank James, and Mr. Adams left us to move forward that apprehension. He is still considered at large. At large in Washington, Anne-Marie, is the fears of an election. I want you to frame for us what the end of April looks like for the various parties in Washington. What is the desperation of the president to right the ship?
Well, they just have a few months left, really, right? And it's them against a race against the clock. I would say on the inflation data, that has been poll after poll, and what you're hearing from Republicans on the Hill, this is what they are going to be attacking Democrats for. It's your prices of gasoline at the pump, the price of groceries. Across the board, they are seeing inflation. Now, if this was going to be the peak and it starts to at least loosen up a bit, potentially individuals will start voting who many believe really vote with their pocket. This could potentially help them if, say, you have better prints in September, October, and of course, but right before the polls in November. So it's very difficult to judge this out without seeing the economic data. But right now, it is so clear that this is the biggest issue. And the president spoke to this yesterday.
Right.
They're removing the E15 regulation for the summer, having available more ethanol and gasoline. Anything they can do. And they say, that's going to reduce the price of a gallon of gasoline 10 to 15 cents. I'm not saying it's going to work, but you can see that they are trying to really show the electorate that they are working to bring these prices down.
Lisa, do you think Anne-Marie's ever seen a cornfield in Iowa? I mean, what do you think is Lisa, what do you think here?
You're talking because I also have lived in Fargo, North Dakota, so I've gone from New York City to Fargo, North Dakota. But we'll get into that another time. Yeah, I'm absolutely metamethanol, though it's sort of corn, right? You're growing gold at this point, given some of the prices. When we talk about inflation, though, it really is different. Sort of to tie all the stories together, it's different depending where you go. If you go down to Florida, you could see a 10%, month-over-month inflation in some places versus New York City, which is seeing a much lower pace of inflation because so many people moved out of some of the urban centers. I mean, how much is this really going to be an agenda, this sort of idea of this equalizing in a nation that actually affects the political landscape in ways that perhaps we're not counting heading into the midterms?
Yeah, it's a great question because also if you look at gasoline prices, say in California, it's astronomical then compared to other parts of the United States. So, and all politics is local, right? So, but this is part of the problem for the midterm elections. Already the president and the Democratic Party is up against just historical facts that the party that's in power usually loses a number of seats. That has been the trend since the end of World War II. So already many are preparing for a red wave. So they have a number of issues they need to try to turn the dial on to keep these congressional seats, to try to keep their slimmest of majorities, 50-50 in the Senate. At the same time, you have the Republicans every day hammering them for really the two big issues, which is the economy and crime.
Emery Horton, thank you so much. An extended conversation, always of value in Washington. Of course, Lisa Bramwitz and I will be in Washington tomorrow for conversations on the international economy with the International Monetary Fund and selected guests as well. Maybe we'll even get to talk to Anne-Marie Horton.
I hope so.
How that
We'll talk about cornfields.
Lisa, we have to talk about the shock and awe, to talk of the markets here within all these horrific local and international events. Lisa, 2.69% on the 10-year yield. This has been a huge reversal in the yield higher curve inversion idea.
It's hard to parse out the technical versus the fundamental. I'm not going to try. I will say a lot of people were talking about overshooting, perhaps hawkishness, and overshooting some of the inflationary expectations. It is confusing to me, Tom, that we are actually seeing inflation come in hotter than expected. It is not confusing, though, to see earnings reports reflecting that, and perhaps that's the realization here, that this cannot last, Tom. If we continue to get this kind of inflationary read, consumers will push back, and you'll start to get some sort of naturalization of the inflationary impulse.
We're going to continue with our coverage here this morning on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television. I do want to point out that we'll talk to Peter Scheer, of course, here of Academy, and we'll have a fixed income bias there. Let me explain to you the foreign exchange market before the opening bell. It is something we've underplayed. It is tangible. Stronger dollar. The euro considers a 107. And the Japanese government this morning of various institutions began to jawbone an ever weaker yen. Dollar yen right now at 125.79. Please stay with us. We continue with this special coverage. The Open. This is Bloomberg.
The Delhi airport, and behind me you can see SpiceJet 737 MAX aircraft. SpiceJet Chairman Ajay Singh earlier today said that Boeing is going to compensate SpiceJet in form of cash and aircraft. Celebration happening at the Gwalior airport. As you can see, they've literally rolled down the red carpet for SpiceJet Chairman Ajay Singh. There are balloons, there are flowers. This is a big deal for SpiceJet because it is the only Indian operator of Boeing 737 MAX planes currently.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Well, it's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
This is Countdown to the Open. I'm Lisa Abramowitz in for Jonathan Farrow. We just are moments away from the start of trading. We have seen a volatile session starting with some strength. It has faded as we head closer to the open. S&P futures now solidly negative, down 0.1%. The Nasdaq's given up almost all of their gains. Russell still maintaining up 0.2%. What's happening in the bond space, though, yields lower, even as we get the fastest pace of price inflation for producers going back to 2010. You do see that two-year yield, that 10-year yield going to 2.6987% from 2.82% at the high yesterday. And the dollar strengthening does persist. I have to say, this is a very confusing moment. I am here with Tom Keene, with Kaylee Lyons. We are broadcasting both on radio as well as on television at a delicate moment where we're looking at earnings reflecting both strength when you take a look at Delta and the incredible demand, and then you look at JP Morgan talking about increased credit loss provisions as a result of some of this uncertainty. Peter Scheer has been parsing through all of this and has a fantastic view joining us right now. Peter Scheer, of course, with macroeconomics, with the full view. What's your view on how we should read this moment?
So I'm starting with equities. I think equities right now are, to me, an easier read. I expect equity indices to go back to the pre-March Fed lows. So I think we get back and retest that. So I think you're going to see ongoing pressure in the equity markets. To me, that translates to pressure on credit spreads. So I think we see credit spreads widen, particularly the IG sector, which has held in pretty well in the last month or so. And then finally, on treasury yields, it's a little bit more up in the air. I really actually think the 2-year, 3-year, 4-year space, I want to be buying those. I think those yields can head lower. I'm a little bit more confused in the 10s to 30s.
Peter, you're great at looking across equities, bonds, currencies, commodities. I'm seeing tangible currency signals of an unraveling with euro almost hitting a 107. It's almost like a David Folkers Landau moaning from Deutsche Bank with the depreciation we're seeing against the dollar. From where you sit at Academy, is the system malleable now and functionable, or do you look at it with kinks or with breakpoints?
So I think we're at this early stages of a real shift in how we have to think about Europe, how we have to think about dealing with autocratic nations, not just Russia, but also China, the Middle East. And I think that's creating this new shift where you're getting the commodity nations and the autocrats aligning with China because China is a massive consumer of what they're selling. They need it. I think Europe is going to struggle. I think you're going to start seeing all these second order effects. And you don't know what it's going to be, whether it's going to be car harnesses or neon production. Europe's going to have a lot of trouble, and food's going to be a problem over the summer as well. So I think it makes sense to avoid European assets right now.
Well, and when we're talking about food, that leads me to the idea of just higher prices across the board, higher input costs that companies are facing. You're starting to see that showing up in earnings. Bed Bath & Beyond, one example, it's down about 12% at the opening bell after posting a surprise loss, warning of supply chain issues. And the interesting line out of the company is that they're starting to see consumer demand taking a hit. Peter, are we reaching or at the limit of the ability of these companies to exercise pricing power and to pass costs on?
Yeah, I think that's very accurate right now. People are just kind of getting hit left, right, and center, right? Whether it's gas, whether it's food, whether it's all the goods and services they're buying. So we're seeing that. At the same time, you're seeing mortgage rates go spike higher. So I think you could get this double whammy where consumers are a little bit spent out, they're tapped out, it's getting too expensive for them to buy, and the housing market could start turning very quickly. So that's why I do think that the Fed is going to be able to maintain QT, which is dangerous for stocks. I think they're going to have to backpedal on all the rate hike talk, though, because I think that the economy is more precarious than people are talking about.
And Peter, this is perhaps reflected in the banking sector as well as we parse through some of the earnings and take a look at some of the opening bell moves. JP Morgan now down substantially, at one point down more than 4%, now down about 3%. But I was just looking, that is the lowest since January 5th, 2021. For perspective, JP Morgan gained 25% last year. We have almost erased those gains. Peter, what is this saying at a point when we are seeing a re-steepening in the yield curve and you're actually getting some income for overnight rates?
Well, what I think is people overestimate what 2s10s means for banks. Most banks are fairly well hedged, and that affects their income, but that's really slow and over time. Where banks make a lot of their money is on transactions. And if you see that housing market slow, the number of refis goes down, the number of new mortgages go down. I think that's a bigger hit. If people start tapping out of their credit cards and saying, hey, I better start paying this off now because yields are getting too high. So I think you could see a bit of a consumer-led slowdown, a housing-led slowdown. And that to me is much worse for bank earnings than anything to do with 2s10s yield curve.
Peter, a lot of people will say this is an overbeared market. People have gotten so bearish and so down in the dumps at a time when companies are still doing pretty well. How do you sort of parse through that noise, which is real, and come up with some sort of conviction about the direction of travel?
You know, I think it's very tricky. You try and sit here and read the signs and occasionally get lucky, like yesterday morning where we were telling people, okay, we're bearish, but it felt like it really wanted to pop after CPI. We got that. That got you a chance to reload. So you're managing that, and it does seem, though, it swings excessively to extreme bearishness, to extreme bullishness. One thing we spend a lot of time thinking about is that there is very little liquidity either direction, right? We always think about no liquidity on the way down. There's no liquidity on the way up or down, which means any signal you get is lost. So I think you've got to be a little bit nimble. You're running smaller position sizes. So I'm trading this from the bearish side. And again, at the back of that, you look for long ideas. I want to be long some emerging markets, especially Latin and South America. I love the oil and energy space. I think we are going to spend so much money not only building out sustainable energy, but reinvesting and refocusing on traditional energy sources. The oil services, those companies like that are going to do very, very well. So there's opportunities within this whole kind of mess to try and trade around.
Peter, you know the Lehman Index, the Bloomberg Aggregate Index, the credit index, I believe, is down 13%, pretty much the largest drawdown in history. That's French Peter Cheer at Academy for a bond bear market. I'm fascinated by the equity language. Do you buy the bond dip?
So I want to start shifting into some bonds. I think you are going to see people looking at this and saying, okay, this is a little bit more permanent. And to me, when we had quantitative easing, what that does is at every part of the point on the yield curve and risk curve, someone gets pushed out, and I think the reverse is going to happen on the way back in.
Okay,
I think you're going to see
Bitcoin. Peter, come on, we're friends. We've been doing this a while. Peter, you're at Academy of Securities. Your monthly statement is delivered by carrier pigeon or whatever they do. You know, you bunch of Navy guys. Great. I'm looking at my monthly statement, and I'm south 3 years yield or 4 years yield. You're telling me to buy the dip?
First off, I think on the retail side, everyone just keeps contributing to AGG and BND monthly. It's in their 401ks. I think you've already seen a lot of selling pressures. When you look at the ETFs, there's been already a lot of outflow. So I think people are able to reload right now. It's the institutional investors that are driving. I think people are starting to take a little bit of a nibble at yields here.
What does that mean for the equity market, Peter, when it didn't seem to blink at yields at 2 3/4%? Are we going to reach the point where it does indeed blink and the TINA thesis is called into question?
Yeah, I think we're at that stage right now. I think we're already seeing that where if you take a look, Bitcoin, right, it keeps struggling. And as yields go higher, risk assets, when you look at, say, the higher risk tech stocks, right, they've done worse. So I think you're seeing people reprice risk, and they're focused on steady growth. They're focused on dividends. They're looking for opportunity. They're looking for energy. So I think you're going to, again, I'm not comfortable with equities until they get back to both the March levels of this year, which for most coincides with May 21 levels. So I think that's where we get back. It's another, you know, around 4,200 or something on the S&P, maybe a bit lower. That's where I can get constructive again.
And what's going to be the leadership to the downside, if that makes sense, Peter? What creates the drag? What area of the equity market in particular?
And I think it's still going to be this, you know, the big high-tech stocks where people question the valuations, where people say, well, you know what, we got a good run, we can take some gains, look for something else. And maybe we just want to be a little bit conservative with so much going on right now.
Peter Scheer, thank you so much for being with us, of Academy Securities, head of macro strategy. Some really insightful moments as we take a look at a lot of bearishness, yes, but a resilient market nonetheless. Even, Kaylee, to your point, as we talked about rate hikes, even when we talked about how high yields were going, stocks didn't blink. Have we reached a point, Kaylee, where actually if yields go down, that's bad for stocks at a time when inflation is still so rampant.
I don't know how we can parse through what is good news and what is bad news. If good news can be bad news simultaneously, Lisa, especially when it comes to this earnings season, if we do indeed see companies able to continue to exercise pricing power, increasing the costs further for the consumer in order to offset the higher input costs they are facing, does that not exacerbate the inflation problem and create a bigger problem for the Federal Reserve that could potentially result in more aggressive action? I mean, it's all circular, and it's really just it's hard to see through it.
I was about to say, Tom, my head's starting to hurt, and I'm wondering, have you ever in your entire career seen a more uncertain moment?
You know, no. The uncertainty here, what in the math of this and the algebra is the epsilon is absolutely off the chart in so many multi-dimensional ways. I do think Jamie Dimon really captured that nicely in his letter. What I wanted to add value, and I know, Lisa, we've got to get to some serious issues. I love how Kaylee cited the Tina thesis. They played Flock of Seagulls like no other cover band I ever heard. The Tina thesis was just outstanding.
Well, and this is that there is no alternative, and they are a great band. We are looking at a market that is churn, although, as Tom was saying earlier, the dollar ascendant, and we are seeing right now a Dow, to your point, lower, but S&P actually resuming some of the gains, and Bed Bath & Beyond, to me, was really the harbinger, perhaps, of what we're going to see among the weaker companies, Tom.
Euro not to a 107 handle, but nevertheless, we're watching weak euro this morning as well. She has had a long 18 hours. Kriti Gupta, after the horror in Brooklyn, was assigned to go deeper to try to understand the geography of Brooklyn in this manhunt for Frank James. We get a briefing now. Kriti?
Yeah, well, I mean, as we covered really throughout the morning, we are still seeing a suspect at large. I think the headline this morning is that this is now the suspect and now not the person of interest. And this, of course, comes after Frank James was connected to a rented U-Haul vehicle. The keys left at the subway platform on 36th Street Station, and that rented U-Haul really connected to addresses in Philadelphia and Milwaukee. That's really all we know in terms of who Frank James is. Of course, some of the social media presence leading to some questions about his background. But for now, that manhunt is ongoing.
Let's go there delicately. And it is a new world. We've seen that in Ukraine with the whole new Biden intelligence on Ukraine, adapting to the transfer of news by social media. We have the official statements. We have the official news organizations. Of course, the privilege of speaking to the mayor a bit ago. All those people are looking at this amazing social media feed, some of it confirmed, some of it accurate, some of it not. What of the social media has caught your attention?
Well, I think it's really coming to how the police force is actually using social media. I'm going to pin this on actually the manhunt and the way they're actually trying to tackle this person. We know there were issues with the surveillance cameras early on, and now it looks like they're trying to and really making pleas on social media for tips, for hotlines, and that's pretty standard practice. But what isn't standard is necessarily looking at surveillance footage, not necessarily just from the subway station, from the surrounding area, but actively on social media. And I think that's really a new era in terms of finding the shooter at large.
Pretty good to thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. A conversation this morning with the mayor of New York.
Based on the briefing from my law enforcement officials and based on the evidence that we were able to accumulate, he has now been upgraded to a suspect. And we're asking all New Yorkers to assist us in his apprehension. Please do not approach him. If you see him or if you know about his, whereabouts, please notify law enforcement.
Can you tell us what you and all of your staff have learned about Mr. James in the last 6 or 7 hours?
Well, this is moving and it's extremely fluid. There's a host of evidence that we have been recovering. The NYPD, the FBI, as well as our state law enforcement entities have all collaborated together. I cannot say enough about the fast work that you are witnessing. They had to piece together this case from the van arrival here to the city, to the devices, to the things that we collected. They're doing a great job in bringing this person to justice.
Mayor, I want to talk here about what we're going to do, as Governor Hochul said, about crime. You know the numbers in Chicago. You don't know the numbers here. I would say that you are arguably the most qualified politician in the nation with your experience from Bushwick years ago out to where you are now to talk about this. First, on cameras, in amendments and civil liberties and all that. London is covered with cameras after terror events. Is this the tipping point where New York City, 1/5 of the cameras of London, begins to monitor the public like London?
Well, I think that I have been talking about this since the time I took office in January. I sent my deputy mayor of public safety across the globe to find out how are we protecting human beings throughout the entire globe. And we are not going to sit back and allow this technology to exist and not protect the people of the city. And we're going to continue to explore it.
Mayor Adams, you also had put more police forces into subway stations to protect the people of the city, given that this is just one in a series of events that have unfolded over the last year during the pandemic, even in subway stations, acts of violence. Clearly that failed yesterday. I know you've said you'd given yourself an incomplete on crime in the first 100 days of your campaign. Is that incomplete looking more like a failure, less like anything of semblance of a passing grade?
Well, we should be clear. We've been here before as New Yorkers. You know, I often talk about my mid-'80s when I started in the transit police, ironically. And I'm aware of what it takes to turn around generational poverty, generational crises that feed violence in our cities. And then we cannot ignore the overproliferation of guns. No, NYPD, my administration has not failed. We have removed 1,800 guns off the streets of our cities since being elected. Just think about that.
Mayor Adams, you are expert at the study of gangs. On January 4th, you stated, you showed up at a press conference and said, we got to do something about gangs. These kids, 3 dead in the last 24 hours, not the headlines like Brooklyn, but 3 dead on Gates Avenue, on Etna Avenue, on Laconia Avenue. What are we going to do about the gangs that pull these kids into crime and violence?
Got to zero in. It's called precision policing, not just throwing out a wide net, but having a precision approach to those who are trigger pullers and violent gangs. That is at the heart of our crises.
They're the mayor of New York City in an important conversation, and we really need to be abundantly clear that we had a headline at that moment of the apprehension of the suspect, and that was corrected by ABC. We're sorry for that. That happens within the news flow that we have. Tom Key with Lisa Bramwitz on a very different, the open today, the sobriety of the moment in Brooklyn, and of course the national reaction to this. As I mentioned there at the end, Lisa, with Mayor Adams, I'm just as much concerned about 3 dead last night in the gun battles of New York City.
And that, I think, is the right approach to take, honestly, Tom, given the fact that it's really the surge in crime more than this one specific incident that has gotten our attention. And for all of us in New York City who've watched the change during the pandemic, where do we get back to in the new normal, Tom?
Right now, an important conversation. Jamil Jaffer is founder, executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason University, I should say. But far more than that, he is acclaimed across Republican theology of law. His clerkship to Justice Gorsuch, among others, of course, many other duties over his years. Jamil, I want to go back to Chicago. Your University of Chicago, and a gentleman that I've had the great privilege of talking to many times, Richard Posner, one of the giants of law. His essay of a decade ago, Privacy, Surveillance, and Law. When are we going to understand, given the carnage of these gun battles, that we are going to have to give up privacy for some form of surveillance?
Well, you know, I mean, this is one of the real challenges. You know, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York that killed nearly 3,000 people in one day, we implemented a lot of procedures and government programs to help protect the nation. And those programs were successful. Over the course of the last 20 years, we've avoided a mass casualty terrorist attack here on U.S. soil. We've had some terrorist incidents, but not a mass casualty event like the 9/11 attacks. Part of that was due in part to these significant surveillance measures we put in place, focused on foreigners located overseas and terrorists located overseas to ensure that we were protected. Now, a lot of those surveillance programs have now ended. Congress has taken action to terminate some of them. Some of them have expired over time. People have forgotten about those events or have allowed them to leave their memory. And I fear that not having those capabilities in place could make us more vulnerable to terrorist attacks. And the same is true on a much smaller scale, although a very damaging scale here, 29 people injured or affected by the smoke attacks and the shooting, 10 people shot. You know, we can see that on a smaller scale, but on a larger scale, these surveillance programs are very important to protecting our nation and have done so for the last 20 years since 9/11.
Jamil, can you give us a sense of what you think is behind the rise of crime, in particular gun violence in the United States and in the big cities most particularly?
Well, you know, we have a situation today, as you know, the economy is facing some challenges. We're seeing inflation. There is a longer trend of gun violence. People have more access, and we're not as good at enforcing our existing laws on gun access and the like. You know, we have a lot of laws in place about who can get guns and who can't get them, about illegal weapons and the like. We have to do a much better job enforcing existing laws and talk about how to get those in place and make sure we're doing the right things. And then, look, a lot of it, too, is a culture that we've seen change in our nation, right? We saw the horrific events of January 6th, right? The way that we talk to each other and the way we think about how to deal with our challenges in this country have left the realm of normal discussion in politics and gone to the form of violence. That's a huge problem. We saw aspects of it over the course of the last 2-3 years really ramping up. That, in part, to me, is contributing part of the things we're seeing here, as well as the economic issues.
Jamil, there's a real distinction between a moment born out of a pandemic where a lot of people saw their common livelihoods destroyed versus something that's stickier. And you really raise a good point that we saw a trajectory of gun violence that this adds to, not necessarily a break from the norm. How far could it go? Are we heading back to what we saw in the 70s, the 80s, and the early 90s?
Well, one hopes that we're not. Obviously, that would be a very troubling trend. We are headed in a direction that looks like that. And the question becomes, how do we arrest that trend, right? Some of that is sociological and cultural. We have to change the way that we deal with one another in this country. It's really become toxic, and we need to address that. Our leaders need to step up and address that in a very robust way. Our leaders themselves have a hard time talking to one another. What do we expect of ordinary Americans, right? And so that's number one. Number two, with respect to the gun laws that we have on the books, we need to start enforcing those laws, right? We have a tremendous number of gun laws on the books, and the president's called for more gun laws. That'll be debated in Congress. But we have a lot on the books today that are not being effectively enforced. We need to focus on enforcing those before we talk about the need for new and additional things to do in this space, in my mind.
Jamil, help me here with the polarity of America. You are one of our legal aces. There's a broad spectrum of opinions. There's polarization, and we see that within this tragedy in Brooklyn, the shooting, crime. What are we going to do about surveillance? You know the story better than anybody listening or watching. How do we get America on the same legal page to get us away from the idiocy of thoughts and prayers?
You know, it's a real challenge. I mean, part of the problem is that I think some of this has to come from the top, right? Part of that has to come from the top and our leaders. Our leaders can barely talk to one another in a civil manner. They can't get stuff done in Congress. They can't get stuff done, between the president and the Hill. We need to start having that kind of conversation. Instead of taking pot shots at one another, we need to start working productively. As voters and individuals, we have to hold our leaders accountable to that standard, and we have to hold ourselves accountable to that standard. You know, all the conspiracy theories that have popped up frankly, on both sides of the aisle, and the way that both sides of the aisle have dealt with problems has not been effective. It's not working, and we've got to change that culture at the grassroots level and expect more of our leaders. And to the extent they don't comply, they don't bring their actions into proper behavior. Let's get those people out of office and put in people who will be effective, not people who will make the polarization worse, as we've seen in recent elections.
But we have seen the president to move away from a James Buchanan, a George Mason theology. President Biden clearly leaned to the left in the early days, the weeks, the months of his administration. Now he yanks back almost to a Reagan center. Can the Republicans do the same thing? And maybe they tilt towards whatever the sense of right is, but come back to the center a la Reagan. Do the Republicans have it in them?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, there are a number of great members of Congress out there who are making efforts to do things like this and work in a bipartisan way. You've seen the Problem Solvers Caucus up on the Hill that's having a real impact up there. And so there are good signs, right? There are people like on the Republican side of the aisle, Mike Gallagher, Mike Waltz, right? On the Democrat side, Abigail Spanberger and Alyssa Slotkin. There are people who can come to the center and find a way to work together. The thing is, we've got to convince our leadership and, frankly, the electorate that plays these primaries that that's the kind of thing we need to get America moving forward again, particularly in this time of increasing inflation and economic challenges.
Do you think that it also has to do with more resources for law enforcement, or do you think that that's sufficient? It's just the actual attitude and the approach taken?
Well, we have seen a walk back in resources and prioritization of law enforcement over the last few years, as we've started to talk about what law enforcement does here in Virginia, where I live. We've seen the removal of school resource officers from public schools because of a concern of what they do. But of course, that's led to some increases in school violence in those local schools. So it's a real concern. I think what we see here is the need to make sure our police are well-funded, well-resourced, and well-trained, right? We can't not account for that latter part. Training is important. We have to make sure our police are doing the right thing. But the idea of defunding the police or reduce their funding is a terrible idea in a time of increasing crime and economic strife.
Jamil Jaffer of George Mason University, thank you so much for joining us today, formerly of the White House, necessarily under President George W. Bush, I should say. It is time now for the trading diary with what you need to see in the day and the week ahead. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen speaking later this morning in the UN Security Council meeting on Ukraine. Goldman City and Morgan Stanley reporting tomorrow. And FedSpeak, of course, continues. Loretta Mester and Patrick Harker, the latest on the roster. And finally, an ECB rate decision rounding off a short week. Of course, also Tom Keene and myself will be in Washington, D.C. for the kickoff of those IMF meetings at a time when inflation very much at the forefront. And we saw that today, Tom, with respect to PPI, and yesterday with CCPI. It's one thing for the U.S. to handle it. It's another thing for nations with a much weaker currency and much more difficult financial circumstances.
Al from New Jersey emails in. Thank you, Al, for listening this morning on Bloomberg Radio. And Al says, are you flying on the same plane? That's not allowed. And no, Lisa has the Gulfstream, Al, and
all right. You're going to complain to him.
I'm taking an Uber.
All right. Well, I will say he'll cry for you, and we all will. I will just point to what we're seeing in markets. You are seeing renewed strength after earnings that do show the dynamism that perhaps is singular in the United States when you look at some of the nations that are struggling more. S&P up nearly 0.4%, 4409. The NASDAQ up about 0.75%. We're looking at broad-based strength. What I find interesting is that even after we saw with PPI today coming in at the hottest since back at least 2010 and CPI yesterday, we're still seeing yields come in dramatically. That 2-year yield, 2.3%.
Yeah, well, S&P drawdown. I didn't do the Dow. Sorry, S&P drawdown -8% right now. I mean, it's a crater.
Well, we'll get back from John Farrow as he writes drawdown meditation on a day when there is so much to focus on. Coming up, we are going to focus more on what we're going to expect from earnings with the other major banks reporting. Interesting that you're not seeing as much of a hit, even though JP Morgan shares sharply negative after reporting a bigger than expected build in credit loss provisions based on the uncertainty and the inflation. From New York, this is Bloomberg.
When you think of cutting-edge technology at sea, you might be thinking of stuff like this. But there's an incoming revolution on the high seas that isn't quite as sexy, but could be significantly more impactful.
Container shipping is the key component of global trade. About 80 or 90% of all the world's goods are transported at sea at some point.
But there's a significant unseen cost to the modern era of global commerce.
About 3% of all the world's CO2 emissions come from shipping.
3% may not sound like a lot, but that's roughly comparable to the entire CO2 output of Germany. Since reducing trade isn't a likely option, what about a technological improvement to help reduce the emissions from these well-stocked maritime behemoths?
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First of